There are few moments in the grim annals of the 42nd millennium as terrible as silence. For 10,000 years, the warp had raged and roared, a tempest of souls and madness that powered empires and devoured worlds. Psykers across the galaxy had grown accustomed to its constant whisper, its ever-present threat, its unending promise of power and corruption. Yet on this day, in a moment that would fracture history itself, the warp went quiet. The silence began at the stroke of midnight, Terran Standard Time, when the great resonance chambers beneath the Imperial Palace registered something unprecedented. Not chaos, not storm, but absolute stillness. The psychic roar that had echoed through reality since the birth of consciousness simply stopped, as if the universe had drawn in its breath and forgotten to exhale. In the chamber of the Astronomicon, 1,000 psychers screamed in unison, their voices, trained to channel the Emperor's will across the galaxy, cracked and broke as they encountered not resistance, but void. The chosen, those blessed souls who had given their lives to power the great beacon, found themselves staring into an abyss that stared back with terrible comprehension. Captain General Trajan Valoris, master of the Adeptus Custodes, witnessed their agony from the observation galleries above. His ancient features, carved from years of vigilance, showed the first crack of uncertainty in centuries. The Golden Throne itself responded to the change with subtle variations in its million-year-old hymnal. Its machinery, more complex than the dreams of the Omnissiah, registered fluctuations that had no name in any techno-liturgy. The Emperor's presence, that vast and terrible consciousness that had held the webway sealed for 10 millennia, remained constant, yet fundamentally altered. Where once there had been the endless struggle against the tide of chaos, now there was something else. Something that felt like waiting. Valoris descended the adamantine steps with measured precision, each footfall echoing through chambers that had known only whispered prayers for 10,000 years. His guardian spear gleamed in the amber light, its blade reflecting the concern he would never allow his voice to carry. Around him, the custodian guard maintained their eternal vigil, yet their movements carried new tension. They had been created to guard against threats to their master. How did one guard against silence? The Psyker chorus fell quiet one by one, not in death, but in bewilderment. Sister Agatha, eldest among the chosen, raised her head with tears streaming down her scarred cheeks. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Captain General, we can no longer hear him. The Emperor's voice, it has not fallen silent, but it no longer speaks through the currents we know. The warp itself has become as still as a tomb. Beyond Terra's atmosphere, the Astronomicon continued its eternal broadcast, yet those with psychic sensitivity noticed the change immediately. The beacon that had guided Imperial ships through the madness of the warp for 10 millennia now cast a different light. Where once it had burned with the fury of a dying star, now it pulsed with mechanical precision. The warmth was gone, replaced by something that felt less like hope and more like the tick of a vast chronometer, counting down to an unknown hour. On Macragga, Primarch Rowboat Gilliman collapsed mid-sentence during a strategic briefing with his Ultramarines command staff. The Lord Regent of the Imperium, architect of a dozen crusades, and heir to humanity's greatest legacy, found himself on his knees in the marble halls of the fortress of Hera. His superhuman physiology rebelled against the sudden absence, as if some vital organ had been removed from his body. Captain Sicarius and his battle brothers rushed to their Gene Father's aid, but Gilliman raised a trembling hand to halt them. "Something is wrong," the Primarch whispered, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "The connection, it is gone. Not severed, not blocked, but simply absent. as if the very concept of psychic energy has been edited from reality. He rose slowly, his massive frame struggling against a weakness that had nothing to do with flesh. Around him, the Ultramarines watched with growing alarm as their lord and master, the most stable of the Emperor's sons, showed the first signs of genuine fear they had ever witnessed. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where madness had reigned supreme since the fall of Cadia, demon worlds experienced a terror beyond anything their inhabitants had known. The realm of Khorne found its rivers of blood running cold and still. Nurgle's gardens withered not into death, but into sterile nothingness. Tzeentch's impossible geometries collapsed into mundane angles, and Slaanesh's palaces of excess echoed with a silence more terrible than any scream. Abaddon, the Despoiler, war master of chaos and the Emperor's greatest enemy, stood upon the bridge of his flagship as alarm screamed through the Black Legion fleet. The Talon of Horus, that ancient relic blessed by the dark gods themselves, had become nothing more than metal and ceramite. Around him, his most trusted lieutenants struggled with demon weapons that had lost their whispers, their promises, their terrible sentience. For the first time in 10,000 years, the forces of chaos found themselves truly alone. Yet it was not merely the loss of power that brought such terror to the servants of the dark gods. It was the realization that they had grown so accustomed to the constant presence of the warp that its absence felt like death itself. Across 1,000 demon worlds, entities that had existed since the birth of civilization found themselves questioning their very existence. The silence was not empty. It was expectant, as if reality itself was holding its breath for something yet to come. On distant Commorragh, Asdrubal Vecht, supreme overlord of the Dark Eldar, felt the change like a blade between his ribs. The Dark City, that impossible realm sustained by suffering and fed by the agony of countless souls, suddenly found its foundations unstable. The psychic sustenance that flowed from real space, like a river of torment, had been reduced to the merest trickle. Ancient homunculi emerged from their laboratories with expressions of genuine confusion, their cruel arts suddenly requiring double the effort for half the effect. In the craft world of Ulthwé, Eldrad Ulthrun experienced his first moment of absolute psychic blindness in over 4,000 years of existence. The greatest Farseer of the Eldar, he who had guided his people through the labyrinth of fate since before humanity reached the stars, found himself as bereft of sight as a newborn child. Around him, the craft world's infinity circuit, that great repository of Eldar souls, flickered with uncertainty. The dead whispered no more counsel. The future, always a tangled web of possibility, had become a blank wall of potential that revealed nothing. Across the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and varied. On worlds where orcs waged their eternal "Way!" weird boys began to convulse and foam at the mouth as the psychic energy that made their crude technology function found nowhere to flow. Mech boys stared in confusion as their impossible contraptions simply stopped working, not broken, but somehow fundamentally altered in ways their crude minds could not grasp. The Great War, fields that bound Orc society together, began to fray, leaving individual greenskins more confused and directionless than they had been since their species first learned to fight. In the cold depths of space, Tyranid hive fleets found their synaptic connections failing. The great hive mind, that terrible collective consciousness that spanned galactic distances, began to fragment into isolated clusters of bioforms. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination for millennia suddenly found themselves adrift, their purpose unclear, their connection to the greater whole reduced to scattered whispers. The Necron tomb worlds registered the change with mechanical precision. Ancient sensors, designed to monitor the flow of psychic energy across the galaxy, detected what their protocols had never been programmed to recognize: absolute null space where the warp had once raged. On Tomb World Solemnus, the silent king Sarek's ancient consciousness stirred with something approaching alarm. His metal features, carved eons ago in mimicry of royal flesh, showed no expression, yet his thoughts raced with calculations that spanned geological time. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for what would come next. In the deepest vaults of Terra, machinery older than the Imperium itself began to hum with new purpose. In the webway, sealed passages that had remained closed since the Great Crusade began to resonate with strange harmonics. And in the warp itself, something vast and patient turned its attention toward the material realm with interest that had been building for 10,000 years. The silence was not absence, it was anticipation, and for those with the wisdom to recognize it, that made it infinitely more terrifying than any storm of chaos could ever be. The galaxy had grown comfortable with its pain, its madness, its endless war against the darkness. Now, faced with true quiet, every soul from the lowest hive-ganger to the mightiest primarch began to understand a simple, terrifying truth. Sometimes the absence of suffering is far more frightening than suffering itself. The warp had gone quiet, and in that silence, something was waiting to be born. The silence spread across the Imperium like a plague of stillness, touching every world, every ship, every soul that had once known the whisper of the warp. In the hours following the Great Quiet, the vast machinery of imperial governance began to fracture as the psychic threads that bound its trillion citizens together simply ceased to exist. On Ophelia VII, Inquisitor Katerina Greyfax knelt in the sanctified chambers of the convent prioris, her scarred hands pressed against her temples in desperate concentration. The Ordo Hereticus had trained her to channel the Emperor's wrath through psychic flame, to burn heresy from the souls of the corrupt with nothing more than focused will. Now, when she reached for that familiar fire, she found only empty darkness. Not the absence of power, but the absence of the very concept of power itself. She rose slowly, her power armor's servos whining in the cathedral silence. Around her, the stained glass windows depicted the Emperor's triumph over the forces of chaos, their colored light casting fractured rainbows across marble floors that had known 10,000 years of prayer. Yet those prayers, she realized with growing alarm, no longer reached their intended destination. The psychic conduit between mortal supplication and divine response had been severed as cleanly as a blade through silk. "Heretical," she whispered to the empty air, though her voice carried none of its usual conviction. For the first time in her long career, Inquisitor Greyfax found herself questioning whether this catastrophe was the work of mortal enemies or something far more ancient and terrible. Her mind, trained in the arts of suspicion and investigation, began cataloguing possibilities. Xenos involvement seemed most likely. The Necrons possessed technology that could manipulate the fundamental forces of reality. The Eldar had always claimed mastery over fate itself. Yet something about the completeness of the silence suggested a scope beyond even their capabilities. Across the galaxy, the librarians of the Adeptus Astartes faced their own crisis of faith. In the halls of the Rock, Chief Librarian Ezekiel of the Dark Angels attempted to commune with the chapter's ancient secrets, only to find the psychic vaults that had protected their shame for 10 millennia sealed by silence rather than sorcery. On Baal, the Blood Angels' librarians discovered that their psychic barriers against the Red Thirst had vanished, leaving their brothers more vulnerable to the curse that had plagued them since their Primarch's death. Brother Captain Varro Tigurius of the Ultramarines stood in the librarium of Macraga, surrounded by tomes of psychic lore that had become nothing more than historical curiosities in the span of a single night. His psychic hood, that sacred relic that had channeled the Emperor's might through a dozen campaigns, now felt like mere metal and ceramite against his skull. Around him, junior librarians looked to their captain for guidance, their young faces marked by confusion and growing despair. "We are not merely warriors of the mind," Tigurius said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "We are guardians of knowledge, keepers of wisdom, and students of the Emperor's truth. That truth does not change because our gifts have been taken from us." Yet even as he spoke these words of comfort to his brothers, the chief librarian felt the cold touch of uncertainty. Without their psychic abilities, the librarians of the Adeptus Astartes were diminished, reduced from mystical warriors to scholars with bolters. The isolation was perhaps most keenly felt within the Scholastica Sicana, the vast institution responsible for training and sanctioning the Imperium's Psykers. Across 1,000 training worlds, instructors found themselves unable to demonstrate the most basic techniques of psychic manipulation. Students who had shown promising abilities the day before now sat in meditative silence, their minds reaching for powers that no longer existed. The black ships, those grim vessels that collected potential Psykers from across the Imperium, found their cargo bays filled with individuals who were no longer dangerous, no longer valuable, and no longer able to serve their intended purpose of feeding the Golden Throne. On Mars, in the deepest forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Archmagos Belisarius Cowl detected anomalies that set his ancient mind racing with calculations. His cogitator arrays, more complex than the dreams of lesser tech priests, registered unusual seismic activity emanating from the Noctis Labyrinthus. The readings suggested that something vast and long dormant had stirred in the depths of the red planet. Cole's mechanical features showed no expression, yet his thought processes accelerated beyond normal parameters as he considered the implications. The Void Dragon had slept beneath Mars since the earliest days of human civilization, its Cetan consciousness bound by the Emperor's will and contained by technology that predated the birth of Terra's star. Yet now, with the warp silent and the psychic barriers that had reinforced its prison weakened, the ancient star god fragment seemed to pulse with renewed awareness. Cowl's sensors detected energy fluctuations that had no place in any known spectrum, emanations that spoke of forces that existed beyond the material realm, yet remained unaffected by the Great Silence. The Archmagos began composing data packets for immediate transmission to Terra, though he suspected the astropaths would be unable to carry his warnings through the void. The knowledge that something as ancient and powerful as a Cetan shard was stirring filled him with the excitement that was part scientific curiosity and part existential dread. If the Void Dragon was responding to the warp's silence, what did that suggest about the true nature of the catastrophe? In the sacred chambers of the Ecclesiarchy, Saint Celestine knelt before a golden aquila that had blazed with holy light for 3 millennia. The living saint, that miraculous fusion of mortal flesh and divine will, found herself unable to manifest even the simplest miracle. Her wings, those glorious appendages of pure faith made manifest, flickered and dissolved like morning mist. For the first time since her resurrection, Celestine felt truly mortal, truly alone, truly afraid. Around her, the battle sisters of the Adepta Sororitas maintained their vigil, yet she could see the questions in their eyes. If their saint could no longer work miracles, if the divine light no longer answered their prayers, what did that mean for the foundation of their faith? Celestine pressed her face to the cold marble floor and whispered entreaties to the Golden Throne, yet received no answer save the echo of her own voice. The navigator houses, those ancient bloodlines whose genetic gifts had made interstellar travel possible, faced their own unique catastrophe. On Terra, in the great spires where the Navis Nobilitae maintained their eternal watch, Navigator Primaris Armand Orth of House Belisarius felt his third eye, that sacred organ that had allowed his family to guide ships through the warp for 10,000 years, close forever. Around him, junior navigators reported similar losses, their mutations fading into mere flesh as the psychic energies that had sustained them for millennia simply vanished. The implications were staggering. Without navigators to guide them, Imperial vessels would be limited to in-system travel or short warp jumps that might take centuries to complete. The great arteries of trade and communication that bound the Imperium together would wither, leaving worlds isolated and vulnerable. Orth began composing emergency protocols for rationing navigator services, though he suspected even the most conservative estimates would prove optimistic. On a pleasure world whose name had been forgotten by all save the Administratum's archives, Colonel Chaffus Kane of the Valhallan Ice Warriors enjoyed what he had assumed would be a peaceful retirement. The hero of the Imperium, whose reluctant courage had saved dozens of worlds, sat in a comfortable chair with a glass of Amasec and a collection of ancient texts. Yet even in his advanced age, the old soldier noticed the change immediately. The constant background hum of psychic energy that had accompanied him throughout his long career, a sensitivity that had saved his life more times than he cared to count, had simply ceased. For decades, Kane had relied on his ability to sense the presence of chaos cultists, genestealer infiltrators, and other psychically active threats. That sixth sense, which he had never fully trusted but had learned to respect, was gone as completely as if it had never existed. The old commissar rose from his chair with a grunt of effort and walked to the window. Outside, the world's capital city continued its daily routine, yet Kane's experienced eye noticed subtle changes. People moved with less purpose, their faces marked by confusion that they could not quite articulate. The psychic white noise that had formed the background of human consciousness was gone, leaving minds clearer but somehow emptier. For the first time in his long life, Chaffus Kane felt truly alone inside his own skull. Across the Imperium, similar scenes played out on 1 trillion worlds. Astropaths found themselves unable to send even the simplest messages across the void, their choir chambers falling silent for the first time since the Great Crusade. Sanctioned Psykers discovered that their dangerous gifts had become mundane handicaps. The entire infrastructure of Imperial communication, built around the assumption that psychic power would always exist, began to crumble. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Great Silence was not what had been lost, but what remained. The Emperor still sat upon the golden throne. The Astronomicon still blazed across the galaxy. The warp itself had not vanished. It had simply become quiet, expectant, waiting. And in that waiting, those with the wisdom to recognize patterns began to understand that this was not an ending, but a pause before something far more significant began. The Imperium had survived 10,000 years by adapting to threats it could understand. Heresy, Xenos invasion, the corruption of chaos. Now it faced something entirely different, the absence of the very forces it had learned to fear and fight. In the Great Silence, humanity found itself confronting a question that had no precedent in its grim history. What happens when the enemy stops attacking and simply waits? The silence that had consumed the Imperium spread beyond the boundaries of human space, touching every sentient species in the galaxy with its terrible stillness. For the ancient races who had known the warp song since before humanity learned to speak, the sudden quiet carried implications that reached far deeper than mere loss of power. It whispered of changes written in the fundamental structure of reality itself. On the craft world Ulthwe, Eldrad Ulthran experienced something he had not known in over 4,000 years of existence: blindness. The greatest of the Eldar Farseers, he who had guided his people through the labyrinth of fate since the fall itself, found himself as sightless as a newborn wraithling. His ancient hands, marked by the scars of 1,000 battles fought across time and possibility, trembled as they gripped the wraithbone throne that had been his seat of power for millennia. Around him, the craft world's infinity circuit flickered with uncertainty. The great psychic network that housed the souls of the Eldar dead, that vast repository of wisdom and memory, had fallen into a silence more profound than death. The voices of his ancestors, always present as whispers of counsel and warning, had been reduced to echoes of echoes, memories of memories that carried no weight of prophecy. Eldrad's mind, trained through centuries of discipline to perceive the threads of fate that bound all things, found itself adrift in a present that seemed to have no future. Yet it was not the absence of foresight that troubled him most. It was the familiarity of the sensation. He had felt this before, in the final moments before She Who Thirsts was born, when the psychic screams of his dying race had reached such a crescendo that even precognition itself had been blinded by the approaching catastrophe. The silence before the storm, he whispered to the empty council chambers, his voice carrying across wraithbone corridors that had known only the constant murmur of psychic communication for 10,000 years. Yet this was different from that ancient catastrophe. Where the birth of Slaanesh had been preceded by psychic chaos, this event had brought perfect stillness. The question that haunted his ancient mind was simple and terrible. What kind of storm required such absolute quiet to precede it? In the depths of the dark city of Commorragh, Asdrubal Vecht felt the change like a blade sliding between his ribs. The supreme overlord of the Dark Eldar, architect of cruelties that spanned millennia, sat upon his throne of living bone and contemplated an impossibility. The Dark City, that realm carved from suffering and sustained by the psychic agony of countless souls, had become truly dark for the first time since its creation. The screams that rose from the torture chambers below no longer carried the psychic resonance that had fed his people for generations. The pain was still present, still exquisite in its precision, yet it lacked the vital essence that had allowed the Dark Elder to stave off the slow decay of their souls. Around him, his most trusted cabals reported the same phenomenon across every district of the city. The psychic sustenance that had flowed like a river from real space had been reduced to the merest trickle. Vector's ancient features, preserved through millennia of calculated cruelty, showed no emotion as he processed this information. Yet his mind raced with implications that reached far beyond mere inconvenience. Without the constant flow of psychic energy harvested from their victims' suffering, the Dark Eldar would begin to age and die, as mortals did. The great game of politics and pain that had sustained Commorragh since the fall would become a race against time itself. Across the galaxy, the greenskin race faced its own unique catastrophe. On countless worlds where the orcs had established their crude empires, weird boys began to convulse as the Wah! Energy that had always flowed through their crude psychic networks found nowhere to discharge. The psychic pressure that had built up over generations of constant warfare suddenly had no outlet, and one by one, the orc psychers began to explode in displays of uncontrolled power that left nothing but scattered spores and confused observers. Warboss Grokirk the Mighty, whose Wah had terrorized the Octarius sector for decades, watched in bewilderment as his favorite weird boy simply burst like an overripe fungus, showering the assembled boys with glowing fragments that quickly lost their luminescence. Around him, his mob began to fragment as the psychic field that had bound them together in common purpose dissolved into nothingness. Without the Wah to give their actions meaning and direction, individual orcs found themselves questioning the very fundamentals of their existence. The technology that had allowed orc civilization to spread across the stars began to fail in ways that defied all logic. Trucks and battle wagons that had run on nothing but enthusiasm and crude mechanical knowledge sputtered to a halt. Weapons that had worked through the collective belief of their users became mere scrap metal. The great rocks that carried orc invasions between star systems found their engines dying, leaving entire War-us stranded in the void between worlds. In the cold depths of space, the Tyrannid hive fleets faced a crisis that threatened the very foundation of their existence. The great hive mind, that terrible collective consciousness that had guided their species across galactic distances for millions of years, began to fragment as its psychic network failed. Individual bioforms, suddenly cut off from the guiding intelligence that had directed their every action, found themselves reverting to base instincts that had been suppressed for eons. Hive Fleet Leviathan, greatest of the Tyrannid swarms, began to turn upon itself as the synaptic creatures that had maintained order among the lesser bioforms lost their connection to the greater whole. Carnifexes turned their weapons against their own kind. Termagants scattered like frightened insects. The great bioships that had carried the fleet across the void began to slow and drift as their pilot organisms lost the ability to navigate by the psychic beacons that had guided them since time immemorial. On distant tomb worlds, where the Necron dynasties had slumbered for 65 million years, ancient sensors registered the change with mechanical precision. In the deepest vaults of Solemnus, the silent king Sarek's consciousness stirred with something approaching recognition. His metal features, cast in mimicry of the flesh he had abandoned eons ago, showed no expression, yet his thoughts raced through memory engrams that stretched back to the war in heaven itself. The readings were unmistakable, though he had not encountered them for millions of years. The psychic null field that now blanketed the galaxy matched patterns from the ancient archives, records of weapons used in the final phases of the war against the Old Ones. Yet those devices had been destroyed, their makers extinct, their very existence forgotten by all save the Necron nobility who had witnessed their deployment. The implications were staggering. Either something had survived from that ancient era, or someone had rediscovered technologies that should have remained buried with the dead gods. Sarek began the process of awakening his most trusted cryptex, those master technicians who might possess the knowledge needed to understand this unprecedented event. Yet even as he initiated the revival protocols, the Silent King found himself confronting a possibility that his mechanical mind had deemed statistically impossible, that the galaxy's youngest race had somehow gained access to weapons that predated their very existence. In the growing Tau Empire, where the philosophy of the greater good had united multiple species under a single banner, the Ethereals faced a crisis that struck at the heart of their civilization. Anva, highest of the ethereal caste, found himself unable to project the subtle psychic influence that had allowed his caste to maintain harmony among the Tau for generations. The natural authority that had made him the voice of the greater good was gone, replaced by mere charisma and the weight of tradition. Across the Sept worlds, similar scenes played out as Fire Caste commanders questioned orders they had never thought to doubt. Earth Caste engineers proposed modifications that contradicted established doctrine, and Water Caste diplomats found their natural persuasiveness reduced to mere rhetoric. The careful balance of castes that had made Tau society function began to shift as the psychic bonds that had reinforced social harmony simply vanished. Commander Shadowson, finest of the Fire Caste warriors, felt the change most acutely during a battle briefing with her staff. The absolute certainty that had always accompanied orders from the ethereal caste was gone, replaced by questions that had never occurred to her before. Why did the greater good require such rigid adherence to caste roles? What gave the ethereals the right to command the loyalty of superior warriors? For the first time in her life, the Tau commander found herself thinking thoughts that bordered on heresy. Deep within the webway, that ancient network of tunnels that connected distant points across the galaxy, sections began to collapse as the psychic infrastructure that had maintained them for millions of years failed. The passages that had allowed the Eldar to travel instantly between craft worlds and maiden worlds flickered and died, cutting off communities that had depended on the network for their very survival. On the craft world Bieltan, Autarch Millennial felt the tremors as entire sections of the webway network simply ceased to exist. The loss was not merely practical, but spiritual, as the webway represented the last great achievement of the Old Ones, the creators who had shaped the Eldar into the galaxy's most psychically gifted race. Its collapse suggested that whatever force was responsible for the Great Silence possessed power that rivaled the legendary architects of reality itself. The silence spread through dimensions beyond the material realm, touching forces and entities that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Yet for all its terrible completeness, the quiet was not empty. Those with the wisdom to listen carefully could detect something else within the stillness, a presence vast and patient, watching the galaxy's reaction to its gift of silence with interest that suggested purpose rather than accident. The Xenos races, each ancient in their own way, each scarred by their unique experiences with the warp's touch, found themselves confronting the same question that plagued humanity. What happens when the fundamental forces that have shaped galactic civilization for millions of years simply stop? And in that question lay the seed of something that had never existed in recorded history, the possibility that the galaxy's warring races might be forced to unite against a threat that transcended their petty conflicts. The silence continued, expectant and terrible, waiting for the galaxy to understand what it had been given and what it would be required to sacrifice in return. In the deepest reaches of the Eye of Terror, where madness had reigned supreme for 10 millennia, the silence brought a horror more profound than any torture the dark gods had ever devised. The chaos space. Marines, those fallen angels who had traded their souls for power, found themselves confronting the terrible possibility that their damnation had been rendered meaningless by forces beyond their comprehension. Abaddon the Despoiler stood upon the command deck of his Blackstone fortress, his ancient armor gleaming dully in the crimson light of dying stars. The War Master of Chaos, architect of 13 Black Crusades and the Emperor's greatest enemy, raised his right arm to examine the talon of Horus. The legendary weapon, blessed by all 4 dark gods and stained with the blood of countless heroes, felt different against his flesh. Where once it had hummed with malevolent intelligence and whispered promises of power, now it was nothing more than ancient metal and ceramite. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. The demon bound within the weapon's machine spirit had not died. It had simply become unreachable, as if separated by a barrier that existed beyond the physical realm. Abaddon flexed his fingers within the relic's grasp, feeling only the mechanical response of servo motors and actuators. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Talon of Horus was merely a weapon rather than a conduit to the realm of chaos itself. Around him, his most trusted lieutenants reported similar phenomena across the Black Legion fleet. Demon engines fell silent, their mechanical prayers unanswered. Sorcerers found their spells reduced to empty gestures. The chaos icons that had blazed with unholy light since the days of the Horus heresy became inert symbols of a faith that seemed suddenly hollow. Yet it was not the loss of power that troubled the War Master most. It was the growing realization that his 10 millennia crusade against the Imperium might have been for nothing. On the daemon world of Sikaris, the word-bearers faced their own crisis of faith. Dark Apostle Erebus, the first to fall to chaos and architect of the galaxy's greatest betrayal, knelt in the shadow of the Templum Inficio and found only silence where once the voices of the dark gods had guided his every action. The cathedral, built from the bones of saints and mortared with the blood of martyrs, echoed with emptiness that seemed to mock the very foundations of his belief. For 10,000 years, Erebus had preached the truth of chaos, the divine nature of the primordial powers that ruled the warp. His sermons had corrupted space marines and mortal cultists alike, spreading the word of the dark gods across 100 worlds. Yet now, when he reached out through prayer and sacrifice to touch the realm he had served so faithfully, he found only the echo of his own voice returning from an infinite void. The realization struck him like a physical blow. If the dark gods could not hear his prayers, If their realm had become unreachable, then what meaning did his millennia of service carry? Around him, lesser dark apostles reported the same phenomenon from across the word-bearer's domain. Some had retreated into meditation, desperately seeking any trace of their patron's presence. Others had begun to question the fundamental tenets of their faith, wondering if they had spent 10,000 years worshipping nothing more than the echoes of their own desperate desires. In the crystal maze of Sortearius, the thousand-sun sorcerers faced a crisis that struck at the very core of their existence. Magnus the Red had promised them knowledge beyond mortal comprehension, power to reshape reality according to their will. Yet now their connection to Tzinch, the changer of ways who had been both patron and tormentor, had been severed as completely as if the god had never existed. Azek Ahriman, chief librarian of the Thousand Suns and architect of the rubric that had transformed his brothers into dust-filled armor, stood in his sanctum surrounded by tomes of forbidden lore that had suddenly become mere books. The psychic flames that had danced around his fingertips for millennia flickered and died. The spells that had allowed him to traverse time and space were reduced to meaningless syllables. For the first time since his transformation, the Master Sorcerer found himself truly mortal, truly limited, truly afraid. The rubric marines that served him stood motionless in their corridors, their dust-filled forms animated not by the sorcery that had sustained them for 10,000 years, but by some other force that Ahriman could not identify. They responded to his commands, yet their movements seemed somehow different, as if they were being guided by a will that was not his own. The realization filled him with a dread that had nothing to do with the loss of his powers and everything to do with the possibility that he had never been in control at all. On the plague world of Barbarus, the Death Guard faced their own unique transformation. Mortarian sons, blessed with the gifts of Nurgle since their fall to chaos, found those gifts beginning to fade like a fever, breaking after a long illness. The plague marines who had not felt clean flesh beneath their armor for millennia began to experience something they had thought lost forever. Healing. Captain Typhus, herald of Nurgle and master of the Death Guard's plague fleet, felt the change most acutely. The swarm of flies that had surrounded him for 10,000 years began to disperse, their buzzing voices no longer carrying the whispers of his patron god. The diseases that had racked his body since his transformation began to retreat, leaving behind flesh that was scarred but recognizably human. For the first time in memory, Typhus drew breath without tasting corruption, felt his hearts beat without the rhythm of decay. Yet instead of relief, the experience brought only confusion and loss. The gifts of Nurgle had defined his existence, had given meaning to his suffering and purpose to his rebellion against the Emperor's sterile order. Without them, he was simply another space marine, another fallen angel, whose betrayal had purchased nothing but exile and regret. Around him, his battle brothers reported similar experiences, their voices carrying wonder and terror in equal measure. In the pleasure palaces of the Emperor's children, the servants of Slaanesh faced their own unique hell. For 10 millennia, they had pursued sensation beyond the limits of mortal experience, using psychic enhancement to achieve heights of pleasure and pain that would have killed lesser beings. Now, cut off from the source of their transcendence, they found themselves trapped in merely human flesh, capable of only mundane sensation. Lord Commander Eidolon, perfect in his corruption and master of excess beyond imagination, stood before mirrors that had once reflected infinite possibility and saw only his own scarred features. The psychic amplifiers that had allowed him to experience the full spectrum of sensation had become silent, leaving him with nothing but the crude nerve endings of his original flesh. The realization that his millennia of pursuit had led to nothing more than sophisticated self-harm filled him with a rage that was itself frustratingly ordinary. Across the Emperor's children's domain, similar scenes played out as warriors who had devoted themselves to the pursuit of perfect sensation found themselves reduced to seeking ever more desperate physical stimuli. Some turned to self-mutilation, others to acts of violence that would have shocked even their corrupted sensibilities. Yet for all their efforts, they could not recapture the transcendent highs that had made their existence meaningful. It was the Iron Warriors who adapted most quickly to the new reality. Perturabo's sons had always been pragmatists, warriors who valued function over form and victory over glory. When their demon engines fell silent and their possessed weapons became mundane, they simply adjusted their tactics to compensate. Warsmith Honso, master of the Demonculaba and veteran of a dozen sieges, saw opportunity where his brother legions saw only loss. "We were warriors before we were servants of the dark gods," he told his assembled captains in the ruins of Medrengard. "Our strength has never come from their gifts, but from our own discipline and cunning. Let the word-bearers weep for their silent gods. Let the Emperor's children rage at their loss of sensation. We will use this crisis to claim what they can no longer defend." Yet even among the Iron Warriors, not all accepted the change with such equanimity. Some who had served chaos for millennia found themselves confronting doubts that had been buried beneath layers of bitterness and pragmatic acceptance. If the dark gods could be silenced, if their power could be negated, then what did that say about the choices they had made during the Horus Heresy? Had they betrayed their oaths for masters who were less omnipotent than they had believed? Across the Eye of Terror and beyond, Chaos Space Marines began to experience something that many had not felt for 10,000 years: uncertainty about their chosen path. Some, like the Iron Warriors, embraced the change as an opportunity to prove their worth through conventional warfare. Others retreated into desperate rituals and increasingly extreme acts of devotion, hoping to recapture their god's attention through ever greater sacrifices. Yet for a few, the silence brought something even more dangerous than despair or rage. It brought the possibility of redemption. In the depths of demon worlds where repentance had been considered impossible, some of the fallen began to remember what they had been before their corruption. They remembered oaths sworn to the Emperor, brothers who had trusted them, ideals they had once held sacred. The memories were painful, wrapped in 10 millennia of guilt and shame. But they were there nonetheless. The silence continued, patient and inexorable, stripping away the certainties that had sustained the forces of chaos for 10,000 years. In its wake, it left warriors who had defined themselves by their rebellion against order, suddenly questioning everything they had believed. Some would emerge from this crisis stronger and more focused than before. Others would be driven to madness by the loss of meaning in their existence. But all would be changed, for the silence had accomplished something that 10,000 years of imperial warfare had not. It had forced the servants of chaos to confront the possibility that their damnation might not be the eternal condition they had believed it to be. In that possibility lay both hope and terror. For warriors who had learned to find comfort in their own corruption now faced the prospect of having to choose their path anew. The warp remained quiet, offering no guidance to those who had served it faithfully, and no punishment to those who now began to doubt. In that absence of divine will, the Chaos Space Marines found themselves confronting the most terrifying possibility of all, that they were responsible for their own choices, and always had been. In the daemon worlds where the fallen Primarchs had ruled as gods for 10 millennia, the silence brought not merely loss of power, but an agony that transcended physical pain. The demon Primarchs, those tragic sons of the Emperor who had traded their humanity for supernatural might, found themselves caught between two natures as the warp's influence faded. They were no longer fully demon, yet not quite mortal, trapped in a twilight existence that allowed them to remember what they had been before their final corruption. On the crystal world of Sotiarius, Magnus the Red writhed upon his throne of living glass, his massive form convulsing as two fundamental aspects of his being warred within a single body. The Crimson King, once the most psychically gifted of the Emperor's sons, had become a creature of pure warp energy, fused with the remnants of his original flesh. Now, as the connection to Tzeentch's realm was severed, the demon essence that had sustained him for millennia began to war with the mortal consciousness that had never truly died. His Cyclops eye, that great orb that had gazed across dimensions and pierced the veils of reality, wept tears of liquid fire as visions of past and future collapsed into a singular painful present. The knowledge that had flowed through him like a river of stars was reduced to mere memory, brilliant but static, no longer the living thing it had been when channeled through the changer of ways. Magnus pressed his taloned hands against his skull, feeling the bone beneath begin to shift and crack as his demon form struggled to maintain its shape without the constant influx of warp energy. Around him, the 1,000 sons who served as his bodyguard watched with growing alarm as their gene-father's magnificent form began to flicker between states of being. One moment he appeared as the towering demon prince he had become, the next as something smaller, more human, more vulnerable. The sight filled them with a terror deeper than any they had known in their millennia of service. For Magnus the Red had been their constant, their unshakable foundation in a universe of change. To see him reduced to this writhing, uncertain form was to witness the collapse of their very worldview. Yet it was not merely the physical transformation that tormented Magnus. As his demon essence weakened, memories long suppressed by Tzeentch's gifts began to resurface with terrible clarity. He remembered Prospero before its burning, remembered his sons as they had been before the flesh change, remembered the Emperor's warnings about the dangers of the warp that he had dismissed as ignorance and fear. Most painful of all, he remembered the moment when he had tried to warn his father of Horus's betrayal, the psychic message that had shattered the Webway project and sealed humanity's doom. The weight of that knowledge, freed from the rationalizations that demonhood had provided, crushed down upon his consciousness like a mountain of guilt. He had destroyed his father's greatest work through hubris and impatience. He had condemned his legion to a half-existence of dust and sorcery. He had chosen the path of damnation not from malice, but from the terrible combination of good intentions and catastrophic pride. The realization that his choices had been his own, not the inevitable result of fate or divine manipulation, brought him to his knees upon the crystal throne that had seemed so magnificent only hours before. In the plague gardens of the demon world that had once been barbarous, Mortarion experienced his own unique torment. The Death Lord, who had embraced Nurgle's gifts to spare his sons from the agony of the wasting plague, found those gifts slowly withdrawing from his massive frame. The diseases that had racked his body for 10,000 years began to retreat, leaving behind flesh that was scarred, but recognizably that of the Primarch, who had once fought alongside his brothers during the Great Crusade. His breath, which had been poison to mortal lungs since his transformation, began to clear. The swarms of flies that had surrounded him like a living aura dispersed into ordinary insects that showed no supernatural intelligence. Most disturbing of all, the constant pain that had defined his existence since joining with Nurgle's essence began to fade, replaced by a clarity of thought he had not experienced since before his fall. Mortarion raised his hands before his face, watching as the rotting flesh slowly healed, revealing skin that was pale and marked by old scars, but undeniably alive rather than undead. The sight filled him with conflicting emotions that he struggled to understand. Relief warred with loss, hope battled despair, and beneath it all ran a current of shame so profound that it threatened to overwhelm his ancient mind. He remembered why he had chosen this path, remembered the moment when Nurgle had offered him a bargain to save his sons from a plague that would have destroyed them utterly. Yet now, as his demon essence faded, he began to question whether that bargain had been necessary at all. Had there been another way? Had his father possessed the knowledge to save the Death Guard without the need for such terrible compromise? The questions tormented him more than any physical pain ever could. Deep within the palace of pleasures that had grown from the bones of dead worlds, Fulgrim experienced his own metamorphosis with a mixture of ecstasy and horror that would have delighted his patron god in better times. The Phoenician, whose pursuit of perfection had led him to merge with a greater demon of Slaanesh, found his serpentine form beginning to revert to something more recognizably human. The lower body that had become a massive serpent's tail for millennia began to split and reshape, bone and muscle reforming into legs that could bear his weight in a more conventional manner. The additional arms that had allowed him to wield multiple weapons simultaneously withered and were reabsorbed into his torso. Most painful of all, the heightened senses that had allowed him to experience sensation beyond mortal comprehension began to fade, leaving him with merely human perception of pleasure and pain. Fulgrim clawed at his own flesh as the transformation proceeded, seeking to hold on to the daemon essence that had defined his existence for so long. Yet his efforts only hastened the process, each act of self-mutilation healing within moments, as his Primarch physiology reasserted itself over his demonic modifications. The perfection he had sought for so long was being stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the flawed, mortal form he had been so eager to transcend. As his demon nature faded, memories of his pre-corruption self began to surface with devastating clarity. He remembered his pride in the Emperor's children before their fall, remembered the joy he had taken in creating beauty rather than simply consuming it. Most painful of all, he remembered the moment when he had first taken up the demon sword that had led to his ultimate corruption. The choice that had seemed so reasonable at the time, but now appeared as the first step on a path to damnation. On the brass world of the Conqueror's domain, Angron faced his own unique hell as the demon engine existence he had known since his ascension began to fail. The Red Angel, whose transformation into a demon prince had seemed to offer escape from the butcher's nails that had tormented him since childhood, found those ancient implants reasserting themselves as his supernatural form weakened. Yet something unexpected occurred as his demon essence faded. The consciousness that had been subsumed beneath layers of rage and bloodlust for 10 millennia began to emerge with startling clarity. The butcher's nails, those accursed devices that had stolen his capacity for any emotion save anger, seemed to lose their grip on his mind as his Primarch physiology reasserted itself. For the first time in memory, Angron experienced something approaching peace. The revelation was more terrifying than any pain he had ever endured. As his mind cleared, he began to remember fragments of the life he had lived before the nails, glimpses of the gladiator who had fought not for the joy of killing, but for the freedom of his fellow slaves. He remembered caring for his brothers and sisters in the fighting pits, remembered the rage that had consumed him when the Emperor had teleported him away from their final battle, leaving them to die without him. The weight of 10,000 years of senseless slaughter crashed down upon his clearing consciousness like an avalanche. He had spent millennia believing that his rage was justified, that his endless war against the imperium was righteous vengeance for the wrongs done to him and his people. Yet now he began to understand that his anger had long ago ceased to serve any purpose save its own perpetuation. He had become exactly what the nails had been designed to create, a weapon that existed only to kill. Across the demon worlds, the legions that served these fallen Primarchs began to fragment as the supernatural bonds that had united them under their gene father's will dissolved. The Thousand Suns found their rubric beginning to fail, dust-filled armor collapsing as the sorcery that animated it weakened. The Death Guard discovered their unity of purpose fading as Nurgle's gifts retreated, leaving them as individual warriors rather than a cohesive plague host. The Emperor's children descended into factional warfare, as their shared pursuit of excess lost its psychic reinforcement. The World Eaters simply scattered, their berserker rage cooling into confusion without Khorne's constant whispers of bloodshed. The demon primarchs made desperate attempts to reconnect with their patron gods, pouring their remaining power into rituals that had once shaken the foundations of reality. Yet their efforts only resulted in deeper silence, as if the warp itself had become deaf to their entreaties. Magnus wove spells of such complexity that they should have torn holes in space-time, yet produced nothing but flickering lights that faded within moments. Mortarion called upon plagues that should have withered entire star systems, yet succeeded only in creating ordinary diseases that died within hours. As their demon essences continued to fade, each of the fallen primarchs found themselves confronting the same terrible truth. They were becoming human again, not the gods they had believed themselves to be, not the transcendent beings they had sought to become, but flawed, mortal creatures capable of regret and shame. The knowledge of what they had done during their millennia of damnation, stripped of the rationalizations that demonhood had provided, threatened to drive them into madness more complete than any chaos corruption. Yet in that approaching madness, some found the seeds of something that had been impossible during their years of service to the dark gods, the possibility of genuine remorse. As their supernatural nature faded, the emotions they had thought lost forever began to return, bringing with them the capacity to truly understand the magnitude of their crimes and the weight of their choices. The silence continued, patient and implacable, stripping away the certainties that had sustained the demon primarchs for 10 millennia. In its wake, it left beings who were neither fully human nor completely damned, trapped in a twilight existence that forced them to confront the fundamental question of what they might choose to become if given the chance to choose anew. The agony of transformation was nothing compared to the agony of remembering what they had lost and wondering if any of it might yet be regained. In the cold depths of tomb worlds that had slumbered for 65 million years, ancient minds stirred with recognition that transcended the comprehension of younger races. The Necrons, those deathless lords who had warred with gods and won, possessed memories that stretched back to the galaxy's youth, when the stars themselves had been different and the laws of reality less fixed than they had become. Now, as censors throughout their empire registered the unprecedented silence that had consumed the warp, one consciousness above all others understood the true magnitude of what was occurring. Sharek the Silent King, last of the Necron royalty and architect of his people's transformation from flesh to living metal, stood in the deepest chambers of his flagship as probability matrices cascaded through his consciousness like falling stars. His form, wrought from necrodermis, more perfect than any craftsman's dream, showed no emotion as he processed data streams that would have overwhelmed lesser minds. Yet within the quantum processors that served as his brain, calculations were being performed at speeds that approached the theoretical limits of computational possibility. The readings were unmistakable to one who had lived through the war in heaven itself. The psychic null field that now blanketed the galaxy matched patterns stored in memory engrams that had not been accessed for geological ages. Sharek's consciousness reached back through eons of archived experience, sorting through records of battles fought when the universe was young, and the distinction between material and immaterial reality had been a matter of active debate rather than established fact. The memory emerged with crystalline clarity, preserved in quantum storage systems that had survived the death and rebirth of stars. It had been near the end of the war in heaven, when the Old One's desperation had reached such heights that they had begun creating ever more unstable psychic races to serve as soldiers in their cosmic conflict. The Satan, those star gods who had been the Necrons' masters and eventual victims, had grown tired of the endless cycle of psychic retaliation that marked each phase of the war. The Void Dragon, most scientifically minded of the Citan, had proposed a solution that was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than creating new weapons to destroy psychic beings, why not create a weapon that would destroy the very concept of psychic energy itself? The theoretical framework had been sound, a device that could generate a null field of such magnitude that it would temporarily sever the connection between the material universe and the realm of souls, leaving psychic beings powerless and psychic-dependent technologies inert. The project had been given the designation Null Echo in the ancient databases, a name that reflected its function of creating a psychic reverberation that cancelled itself out, leaving only silence, where once there had been the constant background hum of immaterial energy. The prototype had been tested on a small scale, successfully neutralizing the Old One's psychic warriors across several star systems. Yet before the weapon could be deployed galaxy-wide, the Citan had fallen to the Necron's rebellion, and the device's location had been lost in the chaos that followed. Now, 65 million years later, someone had found it. Someone had reactivated it. Someone possessed both the knowledge and the capability to deploy a weapon that should have been buried with the death of gods. The implications sent cascading probability chains through Sarek's quantum consciousness, each calculation leading to conclusions more alarming than the last. The Silent King's awareness expanded beyond his physical form, reaching out through the quantum entanglement networks that connected every major tomb world in the galaxy. His commands, encoded in mathematical structures that conveyed meaning beyond the capacity of biological language, rippled across space at speeds that made light seem sluggish. Across 1,000 worlds, Necron pylons began to pulse with new purpose as ancient systems responded to imperatives that had not been issued for millions of years. On Solomus, tomb world of Trazyn the Infinite, massive blast doors that had been sealed since the Great Sleep began to grind open, revealing galleries of specimens collected from across the galaxy's history. The collector stirred from his long meditation, his mechanical senses immediately detecting the quantum signatures that indicated a dynasty-wide mobilization was beginning. His consciousness, focused for eons on the pursuit and preservation of historical artifacts, shifted gears with mechanical precision as he began cataloging which specimens might prove useful in understanding this unprecedented crisis. In the Ghoul stars, where Necron tomb worlds had maintained their vigil against extragalactic threats for millions of years, overlords who had not stirred since before the birth of human civilization began to emerge from their crypts. Their awakening was not the gradual emergence typical of scheduled revivals, but the urgent consciousness shift that accompanied genuine emergences. Status reports flooded through quantum networks as ancient minds assessed the state of their domains and found them fundamentally altered by forces beyond their initial comprehension. On the crown world of Mandragora, Illuminor Seras received the Silent King's imperatives with something approaching excitement. The Master Cryptek, whose scientific curiosity had survived the transformation from flesh to metal intact, immediately began mobilizing his research facilities for a project of unprecedented scope. His laboratories, carved from living rock and equipped with technologies that predated the oldest civilizations, had studied every form of life the galaxy had produced. Now they would turn their attention to understanding the nature of psychic silence itself. Within hours of receiving his orders, Seras had dispatched harvester fleets to capture representatives of every major psychic species. Eldar Farseers, human astropaths, orc weird boys, and even Tau ethereals were brought to his research chambers in specially designed null field containers that preserved their psychic potential while keeping them in stasis. The Cryptek's mechanical features showed no expression as he began his work, yet his quantum consciousness hummed with anticipation that bordered on what organics might have termed joy. The initial results confirmed the Silent King's worst fears. The psychic null field was not merely suppressing psychic abilities, it was fundamentally altering the relationship between consciousness and reality itself. Seras discovered that the captured Psyker's brains were slowly adapting to the absence of psychic energy. their neural pathways beginning to atrophy in ways that suggested permanent damage. More troubling still, the cryptech detected subtle changes in the quantum structure of spacetime itself, alterations that suggested the boundary between the material and immaterial realms was being artificially reinforced. The data streams that flowed back to the Silent King painted a picture of gradual but inexorable decline. Psychic energy, Zarek realized, was not merely a tool used by certain species. It was one of the fundamental forces that enabled complex consciousness to exist at all. Without it, the galaxy's intelligent races would slowly lose their capacity for creativity, innovation, and growth. They would become efficient but sterile, capable of maintaining existing technologies, but unable to develop new ones. In essence, they would become like the Necrons themselves, deathless but changeless, preserved but not truly alive. The Silent King's calculations suggested that the process would take millennia to complete, but once begun, it would be irreversible without outside intervention. The younger races would not even realize what they were losing until it was too late, would perhaps welcome the stability that came with the absence of psychic chaos. Yet Zarek, who had experienced both flesh and metal, who remembered what it was like to dream, and had spent 65 million years without that capacity, understood the true horror of such an existence. His quantum consciousness reached a conclusion that would have surprised those who knew the Necrons only as emotionless machines bent on galactic conquest. The null echo weapon represented a threat not merely to the current galactic order, but to the very possibility of life itself ever rising above mere mechanical function. It was a doomsday device, in the truest sense, one that would leave the galaxy populated but empty, filled with beings who could think but not imagine, who could exist but not truly live. The Silent King began issuing orders that would mobilize the Necron dynasties for their first coordinated action since the war in heaven. Yet these were not the commands of a conqueror seeking to expand his empire, but those of a guardian preparing to defend something precious and irreplaceable. Tomb fleets that had slumbered for geological ages began to stir, their crews awakening to find themselves assigned not to campaigns of conquest, but to a mission of investigation and preservation. Cryptic concaves were tasked with analyzing the null echo's quantum signature, searching for patterns that might reveal its source and suggest methods of countering its effects. Overlords who had spent millennia planning the subjugation of organic life found themselves assigned to protect the very populations they had once intended to harvest. The irony was not lost on minds capable of processing multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, yet it was accepted with the mechanical precision that characterized all Necron responses to logical imperatives. As reports continued to flow in from across the galaxy, Zarek began to understand that this crisis might represent the first genuine threat to emerge since the war in heaven itself. The younger races, for all their chaos and inefficiency, possessed something that the Necrons had traded away in their transformation: the capacity for genuine change and growth. To see that capacity destroyed would be to witness the death of the galaxy's future, leaving nothing but the eternal present of mechanical existence. The Silent King stood in his command chamber, surrounded by displays that showed the extent of the psychic silence spreading across known space, and made a decision that would have been incomprehensible to his subjects millions of years earlier. The Necron dynasties would wake not to conquer, but to cure. They would mobilize their ancient technologies not to destroy life, but to preserve it. For perhaps the first time since their transformation from flesh to metal, the Necrons would act not as harbingers of death, but as guardians of something infinitely precious, the possibility that consciousness itself might continue to evolve and grow. The silence continued to spread, patient and inexorable, yet now it faced opposition from minds that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, that remembered when the galaxy was young and the future was still unwritten. The war to preserve consciousness itself was about to begin, and at its head would march the deathless legions of beings who had chosen eternal existence over transcendent growth, but who now understood that their choice had been meaningless if no one else retained the capacity to choose at all. In the deepest sanctums of the imperial palace, where the golden throne had maintained its ceaseless vigil for 10,000 years, the silence brought changes that defied the understanding of even those who had served the master of mankind since the dark days of the Horus heresy. Terra, the throne world of humanity and beating heart of a million-world empire, found itself at the center of mysteries that seemed to suggest the unthinkable, that the emperor of mankind had not merely endured this crisis, but had somehow anticipated it. Captain General Trajan Valoris stood in the Sanctum Imperialis, his golden armor reflecting the amber light that had bathed the golden throne for millennia. Yet even that familiar illumination seemed subtly different now. The master of the Adeptus Custodes, guardian of humanity's greatest secret, watched the vast machinery that sustained his lord's broken body with eyes that had witnessed wonders and horrors beyond count. What he saw now challenged assumptions that had guided the Imperium's darkest policies for 100 centuries. The daily ritual that had defined Terra's existence since the Emperor's internment had become unnecessary overnight. For 10,000 years, 1,000 Psykers had been sacrificed each day to sustain the Golden Throne's function, their life force drawn into the vast machinery to power the psychic beacon that was the Astronomicon. The terrible mathematics of this sacrifice had been accepted as the price of humanity's survival, a grim necessity that justified the continued harvest of souls across the galaxy. Yet now, as the warp's silence continued into its third day, the psychic furnaces that consumed these offerings had grown cold. The Emperor's presence within the throne seemed to require no external sustenance, as if the fundamental nature of his existence had shifted beyond the need for such crude fuel. The Psykers who would have been sacrificed stood in holding chambers below the palace, confused and frightened, while their custodian guards struggled to understand protocols that had never been written for such circumstances. Valoris had ordered the cessation of the daily sacrifice, not from mercy, but from pragmatic recognition that the ritual had become meaningless. The Golden Throne's biomechanical systems continued to function. The Emperor's vital signs remained stable, yet something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the master of mankind and the device that had sustained him through 10 millennia of living death. The custodian guard, those golden sentinels whose superhuman perceptions had been honed to detect the subtlest variations in their lord's condition, reported phenomena that bordered on the impossible. The Emperor's psychic presence had not diminished, as had occurred with every other Psyker in the galaxy, but had instead taken on a quality that defied description. Where once it had blazed with the fury of a caged star, now it possessed the patient stillness of deep space itself, vast and watchful and utterly alien to anything they had experienced before. In the chamber of the Astronomicon, where 10,000 specially trained Psykers had channeled the Emperor's will across the galaxy for centuries, similar changes were manifesting. The great beacon continued its eternal broadcast, yet its nature had fundamentally altered. Tech priests monitoring the sacred machinery reported that the psychic resonance patterns had shifted to frequencies that existed outside their understanding of warp dynamics. Magos Dominus Caldeon Draconis, master of the Astronomicon's sacred mechanisms, stood before cogitator arrays that displayed readings his decades of service had never prepared him to interpret. The beacon's output remained constant, its reach undiminished, yet the source of its power had changed in ways that challenged the fundamental principles of imperial psychic engineering. Where once the Astronomicon had been fueled by the Emperor's will, channeled through human sacrifice, now it seemed to draw upon something else entirely, something that existed beyond the traditional boundaries of material and immaterial reality. The throne responds to different imperatives now, Draconis reported to the assembled tech priests, his voice carrying the mechanical intonation that marked decades of cranial augmentation. The biomechanical interfaces that have sustained the Emperor for 10 millennia are adapting to new parameters. It is as if the machine spirit has awakened to fulfill a purpose for which it was originally designed, but which has remained dormant until now. The implications of these observations troubled Valoris more than any direct threat could have. The Captain General had access to the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace, records that stretched back to the dark days when the Emperor had first been interred upon the Golden Throne. Yet nowhere in those ancient texts had he found reference to the device possessing capabilities beyond its known functions of sustaining life and projecting the Astronomican's light. His investigation led him to sealed chambers that had not been opened since the days of Malcador the Sigillite, vaults containing documents that predated the Imperium itself. What he found there challenged his understanding of the Golden Throne's true nature. Technical schematics showed components that bore no resemblance to any Imperial technology, designs that seemed to incorporate principles of physics that humanity had not yet discovered. More disturbing still were marginalia in the Emperor's own hand, notes that suggested the device had been modified for purposes that its original creators had never intended. One document, bearing the Emperor's personal seal and dated to the earliest days of the Great Crusade, contained calculations that made Valoris's enhanced mind reel with their implications. The Master of Mankind had foreseen a crisis that would threaten the very foundations of psychic reality, and had spent millennia preparing for it. The Golden Throne was not merely a life support system, but a device capable of functioning on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, including levels that would remain stable even if the warp itself was silenced. In the sprawling complex that housed the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, confusion reigned as the organization that had managed humanity's psychic population for 10,000 years found its entire purpose called into question. Astropaths who had spent decades learning to project their minds across the void sat in silent chambers, their abilities reduced to nothing. The great choirs that had carried messages between distant worlds fell quiet, their psychic harmonies replaced by mundane confusion. Master of the Scholastica Psyker, Agnathia watched his life's work crumble as reports arrived from across Terra detailing the scope of the crisis. Training facilities that had processed thousands of potential psychers each year now housed students whose abilities had simply vanished. The black ships continued to arrive from distant worlds, their holds filled with individuals who were no longer psychically active. The entire infrastructure of Imperial psychic management had become obsolete in a matter of hours. Yet it was not the collapse of established systems that troubled Agnathio most, but the reports that began filtering in from across Terra's population. Pilgrims who had journeyed to the throne world seeking the Emperor's blessing reported experiences that defied explanation. In dreams that felt more real than waking life, they claimed to hear the Master of Mankind speaking to them directly, not through the warp, as had been recorded in rare instances before, but through some other means entirely. The dreams, when reported to Imperial authorities, showed remarkable consistency, despite originating from individuals who had never met. The Emperor spoke of patience, of preparation, of a plan that spanned millennia finally reaching its culmination. He spoke of silence, not as absence, but as the space between notes that gave music its meaning. Most disturbing of all, he spoke as if the current crisis was not a catastrophe to be endured, but a transformation to be embraced. In the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace, ancient servitors that had not stirred for millennia began to activate, their mechanical forms moving through sealed chambers with purpose that suggested programming that had remained dormant for geological ages. They carried out tasks that made no sense to observers, rearranging crystalline components in patterns that seemed random, adjusting the flow of power through circuits that connected to nothing identifiable, preparing systems whose functions remained mysterious even to the highest-ranking tech priests. Archmagos, Dominus Belisarius Caul, summoned from Mars by urgent astropathic communication, that had somehow reached him through conventional means, arrived on Terra to find the Golden Throne complex transformed in subtle but profound ways. His enhanced senses detected energy signatures that had no place in orthodox imperial technology, emanations that suggested the activation of devices that predated humanity's expansion into the stars. The throne was never merely a life support system, Cole informed the assembled High Command, his voice carrying the certainty of one who had studied Xenos technology for millennia. It incorporates elements that suggest contact with civilizations whose understanding of reality far exceeded our own. The Emperor did not simply modify existing technology. He created something entirely new, something that was designed to function regardless of the state of psychic reality itself. The revelation that the Master of Mankind had spent 10,000 years preparing for this moment brought both comfort and terror to those who heard it. If the Emperor had foreseen this crisis, if the Golden Throne had been designed to function during such an event, then perhaps humanity's survival was assured. Yet the same knowledge raised questions about the nature of that survival, about what the Emperor intended for his species once the warp silence had accomplished whatever purpose he had envisioned for it. As the fourth day of silence dawned over Terra, bringing no change in the galaxy-wide phenomenon, the populations of the throne world began to adapt to their new reality with the resilience that had carried humanity through 10,000 years of darkness. Yet beneath the surface of daily routine, profound changes were taking place. The psychic background radiation that had shaped human consciousness since the species' birth was gone, leaving minds clearer but somehow emptier, more focused but less capable of the leaps of intuition and creativity that had driven humanity's greatest achievements. In the Golden Throne chamber itself, where the Emperor's broken body had sat in eternal vigil for 10 millennia, new changes were manifesting. The biomechanical systems that sustained his life showed readings that suggested not merely stability, but preparation for something unprecedented. The golden mask that covered his face seemed somehow more expressive, as if consciousness, long trapped within dying flesh, was beginning to stir toward some greater purpose. The silence continued, patient and expectant, while on Terra the implications of 10,000 years of preparation began to reveal themselves. The Emperor had not merely endured this crisis, he had orchestrated it, planned for it, shaped the very foundations of his imperium to survive it. Yet as the truth began to emerge, those who served him most faithfully found themselves confronting a question that challenged their deepest beliefs. If their master had possessed the power to prevent this crisis, why had he chosen instead to ensure that it would come to pass? The answer, they suspected, lay not in the past, but in the future, in a vision of humanity's destiny that stretched far beyond the comprehension of even his most devoted servants. Terra waited, as it had waited for 10 millennia, for the Emperor's will to be revealed. Yet now that waiting carried the weight of imminent revelation, the sense that the Master of Mankind was finally ready to unveil the truth of what he had been preparing for all along. In the cold depths of intergalactic space, where the Tyranid hive fleets had drifted for millions of years in their endless hunger, the silence brought a chaos more complete than any defeat they had ever suffered. The Great Devourer, that collective consciousness which had consumed entire galaxies and left nothing but lifeless rock in its wake, found itself shattered into billions of individual fragments, each struggling to understand an existence without the guiding voice that had shaped their every action since the moment of their birth. Hive Fleet Leviathan, greatest of the Tyranid swarms and terror of the Eastern Fringe, began to fragment as the psychic network that had bound its countless organisms into a single purpose simply ceased to function. The massive bioships that had moved through space with the coordinated precision of a single organism suddenly found themselves adrift, their synaptic creatures no longer capable of receiving or transmitting the imperatives that had guided their actions for eons. On the bridge of the Ultramarines' battle barge Courage Above All, Captain Uriel Ventris watched through the great armored viewports as the Tyranid fleet that had been pursuing his forces for weeks began to tear itself apart. The elegant formations that had marked Hive fleet movements since first contact were dissolving into chaos as individual bioships, cut off from the greater directive, began following whatever impulses their crude individual intelligence could generate. "Captain," reported Sergeant Pausanias, his voice carrying wonder despite the mechanical augmentation that had replaced his larynx, "the fleet is cannibalizing itself. The larger bioships are beginning to consume the smaller ones, not for strategic purposes, but as if they're simply reverting to base-feeding instincts." Ventress nodded grimly, his enhanced vision tracking the death throes of creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. Without the hive mind's coordination, the Tyranids were revealing themselves to be what they had always been, beneath their terrifying unity. Biological weapons whose sophistication depended entirely on external guidance. Yet even as he watched their dissolution, the ultramarine captain felt a growing unease. Evolution was the Tyranid's greatest strength, and organisms that could survive the void of space for millions of years would not simply die when faced with new circumstances. His concerns proved justified when scanning Auspex arrays detected something unprecedented occurring within the disintegrating Tyranid formations. Individual organisms, freed from the hive mind's rigid control, were beginning to exhibit behaviors that had never been recorded in Imperial tactical manuals. Some bioships were attempting to communicate with each other using crude bioelectrical signals, developing new forms of coordination that bypassed the psychic networks they had always depended upon. More disturbing still were the reports filtering in from worlds that had been partially consumed by Tyranid invasions before the silence fell. On Tarsis Ultra, where Hive Fleet Leviathan had established a foothold before the warp went quiet, PDF forces reported encounters with Tyranid organisms that seemed almost confused by their own existence. Hormagaunts that had been bred for nothing but swift assault were wandering in seemingly random patterns, as if seeking direction that would never come. Some had even fled when confronted by human forces, an action so contrary to recorded Tyranid behavior that initial reports were dismissed as hallucinations or enemy disinformation. Yet the most unsettling discoveries came from the bioforms themselves. Magos biologist Quintanus, studying captured Tyranid specimens in his laboratorium aboard the Courage Above All, made observations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the Great Devourer. Many of the creatures showed signs of genetic regression, their sophisticated bioengineered forms reverting to templates that seemed to predate their incorporation into the hive fleets. "The implications are staggering," Quintanus reported to Captain Ventress, his augmetic voice carrying the mechanical precision that marked decades of cranial enhancement. "These organisms appear to be remembering genetic patterns from species that were consumed millennia ago. A single genestealer showed cellular structures consistent with 17 different sapient races, as if the hive mind's control had been the only thing preventing them from expressing every absorbed genetic pattern simultaneously. The result was the emergence of chimeric beings that defied classification, creatures that combined the predatory instincts of Tyranid bioforms with the behavioral patterns and even fragmentary memories of the races they had been created from. Some exhibited signs of what could only be described as confusion, as if multiple sets of instincts were warring within their modified nervous systems. Others showed flashes of what might have been recognition when encountering humans, brief moments where something other than hunger flickered behind alien eyes. Across the galaxy, genestealer cults that had spent generations preparing for the arrival of their star gods found themselves abandoned by the very minds they had worshipped. On industrial world Vigilus, where cult of the Pauper Princes had achieved near total infiltration of the planetary government, the sudden severing of their psychic connection to the hive mind brought chaos that exceeded even the most pessimistic imperial projections. Magus Dayak Grek, fourth-generation hybrid and spiritual leader of his cult, experienced the disconnection as a physical blow that sent him to his knees in the midst of a ceremonial gathering. The voices of the star gods, which had guided his every decision since childhood, fell silent with such abruptness that he initially believed himself to be dying. Around him, his fellow cultists began exhibiting behaviors that ranged from catatonic withdrawal to violent hysteria, as minds shaped by alien influence suddenly found themselves truly human for the first time. Some cult members, particularly those of earlier generations whose human heritage remained strong, began to experience what could only be described as awakening. Memories that had been suppressed by psychic conditioning began to resurface, bringing with them the realization of what they had become and what they had done in service to their alien masters. The horror of this knowledge drove some to madness, but others found within themselves a determination to atone that burned with religious fervor. The shadow in the warp, that psychic null field that tyrannid presence had always cast across nearby space, began to dissipate as the hive mind's influence faded. Yet its absence did not restore the regions it had once covered to their previous state. Imperial astropaths attempting to re-establish communication through areas that had been under tyrannid influence reported that the psychic realm there felt somehow scarred, marked by patterns that suggested the permanent alteration of local space-time. Navigator Yuki Sato of House Belisarius, guiding an Imperial relief fleet through space recently evacuated by tyrannid forces, described the experience as sailing through the psychic equivalent of a graveyard. The warp in these regions showed none of the chaotic energy that normally characterized the immaterial realm, but neither did it possess the sterile emptiness that marked areas affected by the galaxy-wide silence. Instead, it seemed to bear the imprint of the countless minds that had been consumed to fuel the hive mind's growth, a psychic fossil record of extinct civilizations that would never again know the spark of consciousness. The Imperial military response to the tyrannid crisis was swift and brutal. Across a dozen sectors, battle fleets that had been desperately defending against hive fleet incursions suddenly found themselves facing enemies that could no longer coordinate their attacks or adapt their tactics in real time. The Mordian Iron Guard, which had been fighting a desperate rearguard action against Splinter Fleet Scylla, reported that tyrannid forces had simply stopped their advance and begun consuming each other in displays of internecine warfare that suggested complete breakdown of command structure. Admiral Cornelius Vex of Battlefleet Solar saw opportunity where others saw only chaos. The veteran officer, whose career had been defined by defensive actions against seemingly insurmountable Xenos threats, began coordinating the largest offensive operation undertaken by Imperial forces in decades. Strike fleets were dispatched to engage tyrannid formations that had been considered untouchable only days before, their mission to destroy bioships that could no longer call upon the tactical flexibility that had made them so dangerous. Yet even as Imperial forces achieved victories that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, disturbing reports began to filter back from the front lines. Some tyrannid organisms were adapting to their isolation with frightening speed, developing new forms of coordination that relied on chemical signals, bioelectrical communications, and even crude forms of what appeared to be individual learning. The most advanced bioforms seemed to be regaining some measure of collective behavior through methods that bypassed the traditional psychic networks entirely. On the world of Baal Secundus, Blood Angel's librarian Mephiston encountered a group of tyrannid warriors that had been separated from their swarm for several days. Rather than the mindless aggression that characterized most isolated tyrannid forms, these creatures showed signs of what could only be described as deliberate tactics. They had set ambushes, used terrain to their advantage, and even appeared to be learning from their encounters with Astartes' forces. "They are evolving," Mephiston reported to his chapter master, his voice carrying the weight of one who had gazed into the abyss of tyrannid consciousness and found it staring back. Not physically, though that too will come, but behaviorally. The absence of the hive mind has not destroyed them. It has freed them to become something else, something we have never encountered before. The implications of this observation sent ripples of concern through imperial command structures across the galaxy. The Tyranids had always been terrifying because of their unity, their ability to coordinate billions of organisms toward a single purpose. Yet the prospect of individual Tyranid organisms developing autonomous intelligence, of the great devourer's children learning to think and act independently while retaining their biological advantages, presented challenges that existing tactical doctrines were unprepared to address. As the warp silence entered its second week, the Tyranid crisis continued to evolve in ways that defied prediction. Some hive fleets had collapsed entirely, their bioships becoming lifeless hulks drifting in the void. Others showed signs of fragmenting into smaller, more autonomous units that might eventually develop into entirely new forms of threat. A few of the most advanced splinter fleets seemed to be developing new coordination methods that suggested the emergence of distributed intelligence networks, systems that might prove even more dangerous than the original hive mind. The great devourer was dying, but death for a force of evolution incarnate was merely another form of transformation. In the silence left by the hive mind's absence, something new was being born. Multiple somethings, each taking a different path toward adaptation and survival. The galaxy had gained a reprieve from the unified threat that had terrorized it for centuries, but in exchange, it might soon face challenges that were even more unpredictable and potentially more dangerous than anything the original Tyranid swarms had represented. The silence continued, patient and inexorable, while across the galaxy's edge, evolution itself began to write new chapters in the endless war between order and chaos, between unity and individuality, between the hunger that consumes and the consciousness that creates. Across the galaxy's war-torn regions, where the greenskin race had established their crude empires, the silence brought not the expected collapse of Orc civilization, but a transformation that defied every assumption imperial tacticians had made about the Xeno species. The Wah, fields that had bound Orc society together for millennia, that psychic gestalt consciousness that made their ramshackle technology function and their barbarous hordes fight as one, simply vanished overnight. Yet in the absence of that unifying force, something unexpected began to emerge from the chaos of fragmented clans and failing war machines. Gazukul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the Wah and terror of a dozen sectors, stood in the command center of his flagship kill cruiser, and felt the change like a physical blow to his massive frame. The cybernetic enhancements that Doc Grotznik had grafted to his skull, the mechanical augmentations that had allowed him to survive wounds that would have killed lesser orcs, began to fail as the psychic field that had powered their impossible functions simply ceased to exist. His adamantine jaw, replaced after a chain axe, had nearly decapitated him during the Second War for Armageddon, ground against bone and metal as the mech-boy science that had made it function like living flesh reverted to mere mechanical components. The neural implants that had enhanced his already formidable intelligence flickered and died, leaving him with only his natural cunning and the memories of 1,000 battles. Yet as the artificial enhancements failed, something else began to emerge. A clarity of thought that had been obscured by the constant psychic noise of the Wah field. For the first time in decades, Gazkul could think without the constant whisper of Gork and Mork in his mind, without the psychic pressure of millions of orcs across the galaxy, adding their violent thoughts to the collective gestalt. The experience was both liberating and terrifying, like waking from a dream of endless war to find oneself alone with one's own consciousness. Around him, his knob bodyguards shifted uneasily, as they too felt the absence of the psychic bonds that had made them extensions of their boss's will. "Boss," rumbled Makari, his diminutive grot assistant, "De boys are getting restless. Half the trucks won't start, and de mechs are saying their tools don't know how to work anymore." The grot's voice carried a confusion that mirrored what was happening across the Orc fleet, as centuries of instinctive knowledge simply vanished from minds that had never questioned how their technology functioned. Gazkul's response surprised even himself. Instead of the roar of rage that would normally have answered such news, he found himself considering the implications with a tactical awareness that had been buried beneath layers of psychic conditioning. Without the field to make their ramshackle vehicles function, his forces would need to adapt or die. The realization that he was capable of such rational analysis, that beneath the savage exterior beat the heart of a genuine strategic mind, was perhaps more shocking than the loss of his psychic powers. Across the Octarius sector, where the largest Orc empire in the galaxy had been locked in eternal warfare with Hive Fleet Leviathan, similar scenes played out as the psychic foundations of green-skin society crumbled. War bosses who had commanded the loyalty of millions through sheer force of psychic presence found their empires fragmenting as individual clans began pursuing their own agendas. The great Waa's that had terrorized imperial worlds for generations simply dissolved, leaving behind scattered bands of orcs who suddenly found themselves capable of independent thought for the first time in their lives. Yet the collapse was not uniform. While some orc clans descended into infighting and chaos, others began to exhibit behaviors that had never been recorded in imperial tactical manuals. Big Mech Uzgob, whose workshop had produced some of the most effective war machines ever encountered by imperial forces, found that his vehicles continued to function despite the absence of the psychic field that should have been necessary to power them. The difference, he slowly realized, was that these machines had been built with actual engineering principles rather than the collective belief that usually made Orc technology work. Maybe, Uzgob muttered to his assistant as he examined a battle wagon that showed no signs of mechanical failure. Maybe we's been doing it wrong all this time. Maybe the machines work better when you actually know how to build 'em proper-like. The revelation that Orc technology could function on genuine mechanical principles rather than psychic consensus opened possibilities that the Big Mech's crude but effective mind began to explore with unprecedented focus. The loss of instinctive knowledge hit the odd boys particularly hard. These specialist orcs, whose genetic programming had given them intuitive understanding of their chosen fields, found themselves suddenly bereft of the knowledge that had defined their existence. Pain boys who had performed surgery with confidence born of psychic certainty suddenly couldn't remember which end of a saw to hold. Mech boys stared at their workshops full of tools whose functions had become mysterious. Speed freaks found themselves unable to distinguish between accelerator and brake without conscious thought. Yet rather than destroying Orc society, this crisis began to force a kind of evolution. Some Orcs began to consciously learn skills that they had previously performed through instinct. Others started cooperating in ways that would have been impossible when the field enforced crude hierarchy through psychic dominance. Small clans that had been scattered by the collapse of larger empires began forming alliances based on mutual benefit rather than the brutal dominance that had traditionally characterized Orc politics. On the world of Rin's world, where Orc raiders had established a foothold before the silence fell, Crimson Fist's Space Marines reported encounters with greenskin forces that fought with a tactical sophistication that contradicted centuries of established doctrine. Captain Drigo Alves, veteran of dozens of campaigns against Orc raiders, found himself facing opponents who used cover effectively, coordinated their attacks, and even retreated when faced with superior firepower. "They're learning," Alves reported to his chapter master, his voice carrying disbelief despite the evidence before his eyes. Not just adapting their tactics within the battle, but actually planning their engagements in advance. Yesterday's assault on the eastern perimeter showed signs of reconnaissance, feint attacks to draw our forces out of position, and coordinated strikes against our weakest points. These are not the mindless savages we've fought before. The implications of these observations rippled through Imperial command structures across multiple sectors. Orc forces that had relied on overwhelming numbers and crude psychic coordination were being replaced by smaller, more disciplined units that used actual military tactics. Some fought with a pragmatism that made them more dangerous than their predecessors, while others seemed to be developing approaches to warfare that combined the best aspects of their natural aggression with genuine strategic thinking. Warboss Scarjaw, whose clan had controlled a minor asteroid belt before the Silence fell, found himself leading a confederation of smaller clans that had never existed under the old system. The alliance was based not on psychic dominance, but on negotiated agreements that recognized each clan's strengths and weaknesses. His forces began operating more like a professional military than a barbarian horde, with specialized units coordinating their actions through vocal commands and prearranged signals rather than psychic communion. "We still the best fighters in the galaxy," Scarjaw declared to his assembled subordinates. "But now we's gonna fight smart, too. No more rushing into the guns just 'cause the war tells us to. We's gonna think before we crump, and that's gonna make us even more dangerous." The concept of orcs who combined their natural ferocity with actual tactical planning was a development that Imperial strategists were unprepared to counter. The transformation was not without its casualties. Many of the largest orc empires, those that had depended most heavily on psychic unity to maintain cohesion across vast distances, simply collapsed as communication became impossible and subordinate. Clans reverted to their natural independence. The Great War! Gazkul, that had threatened to overrun entire sectors, fragmented into dozens of smaller forces, each pursuing its own agenda, without reference to the grand strategy that had once united them. Yet from this fragmentation came innovation. Orc mechs began developing new forms of technology that relied on actual scientific principles rather than collective belief. Communication systems that used radio waves instead of psychic broadcasts allowed distant clans to coordinate their actions. Some orcs even began developing written languages to record tactical information and technical knowledge, a development that would have been impossible when genetic memory and psychic communion made such records unnecessary. The speed freaks, those orcs whose love of velocity had made them the most mobile elements of any war, found their adaptation particularly noteworthy. Without the psychic field that had allowed their vehicles to function regardless of mechanical logic, they were forced to actually learn how their machines worked. The result was a new generation of orc vehicles that combined traditional greenskin engineering with genuine mechanical expertise, creating war machines that were both more reliable and more dangerous than their predecessors. Commander Kubrick, leading Cadian shock troops against an orc motorized assault on the forge world of Lucius, discovered that his opponent's vehicles no longer suffered from the mechanical failures that had traditionally marked orc technology. "Their trucks aren't breaking down mid-charge anymore," he reported to Battlefleet Command. "They're maintaining formation, using cover, and their weapons are actually hitting their targets. It's like they've traded quantity for quality, and the result is a more dangerous enemy than we've ever faced." As the warp's Silence entered its third week, the transformation of orc society continued in directions that defied prediction. Some clans embraced the change, developing new forms of organization and combat doctrine that made them more effective than they had ever been under the old system. Others struggled to adapt, their societies fragmenting into ever smaller groups until they could no longer maintain the technological base necessary for spacefaring civilization. Yet perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of orc leaders who could think beyond the immediate demands of warfare. Some began planning for long-term survival, establishing manufacturing bases and supply networks that could function without constant psychic coordination. Others started exploring forms of cooperation with non-orc species, alliances that would have been impossible when the Wah field enforced racial superiority through psychic conditioning. The galaxy's greenskin population was evolving, trading the brute force advantages of psychic unity for the flexibility and resilience that came with individual consciousness and rational planning. The result was a Xenos threat that was smaller in scope, but potentially more dangerous in its sophistication, capable of genuine strategic thinking while retaining the natural ferocity that had always made orcs formidable opponents. The Silence continued, patient and transformative, while across 1,000 worlds, the most warlike species in the galaxy, learned to wage war with their minds as well as their weapons. The age of the mindless Wah was ending, but in its place was emerging something that might prove even more challenging to those who had learned to defend against Orc savagery, but had never prepared for Orc intelligence. In the crystal chambers of Craftworld Ulthwé, where the threads of fate had been woven and rewoven for 10 millennia, Eldrad Ulthran faced a truth more terrible than any future he had ever glimpsed through the tangled skein of possibility. The greatest of the Eldar Farseers, he who had guided his people through countless perils since before the birth of She Who Thirsts, understood with crystalline clarity what the silence meant for his ancient race. Without the warp's constant touch, the Eldar would not merely lose their powers, they would cease to exist as anything more than withering echoes of their former glory. The realization had come to him during his meditations in the Dome of Crystal Seers, where the Craftworld's most gifted Psykers had once gathered to divine the currents of fate. "Now we are dying," he whispered to the assembled Seer Council, his voice carrying across wraithbone chambers that had never known such absolute quiet. "Not quickly, as we die in battle, but slowly, as all things die, when cut off from the source of their vitality. Psychic energy is not merely a tool we use, it is the foundation upon which consciousness itself rests. Without it, we will become hollow shells, capable of thought, but not of growth, of memory, but not of dream." Around him, the greatest seers of Ulthwé processed this knowledge with the stoic acceptance that had carried their race through 65 million years of slow decline. Yet even as they acknowledged the truth of his words, they began to plan a response that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. If the Eldar were to survive the silence, they would need to pool their remaining resources in ways that transcended the ancient rivalries and philosophical differences that had divided their people since the fall. Farseer Taldair, whose visions had once guided the Craftworld's warriors through the fire and fury of countless battles, raised her voice in support of measures that would have been considered heretical only days before. "We must contact our cousins in Comora. Distasteful as their methods are, they possess stores of psychic energy that we may be able to tap. The suffering they have harvested over millennia could serve a purpose beyond their own sustenance." The proposal sent ripples of dismay through the council chamber, yet none could deny its necessity. The Dark Eldar, those twisted kin who had embraced the path of cruelty and sensation, had spent millennia harvesting psychic energy through torture and pain. Their reserves, stored in the crystalline matrices that powered Comora's impossible architecture, might represent the only remaining source of the power needed to attempt a galaxy-spanning working. Across the galaxy, other craft worlds received Ulthwé's desperate communications through what remained of the webway's functional pathways. Biltan, militant defenders of the Eldar's ancient claims, set aside their pride to share the psychic energy stored in their aspect warrior shrines. Saimhon's wild riders, who had always prized independence above unity, opened their spirit pools to the greater cause. Even Ayandan, half-populated by the Wraithguard who walked between life and death, contributed the stored essence of their departed souls to the unprecedented effort. In the twisting corridors of the webway, where reality bent according to the will of those who walked its paths, the Harlequins faced their own unique crisis. These enigmatic performers, servants of Kegarak the Laughing God, had always danced between the realms of reality and imagination, their performances echoing across dimensions to shape the fate of their people. Yet now, as Death Jester, Silandri Veilwalker, reported to her troop master, even their divine patron had fallen silent. "The great game continues no longer," she intoned through her skull-faced mask, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic tragedy. Kegarak's laughter, which has echoed through the webway since time immemorial, has ceased. The eternal contest between our laughing god and She Who Thirsts has ended not in victory or defeat, but in mutual silence. The webway paths that once rang with divine mirth now echo only with the footsteps of mortals. The implications were staggering. The great game between Tegarash and Slaanesh had been one of the fundamental forces shaping Eldar destiny since the fall. The Laughing God's cosmic jest had protected portions of the Eldar race from complete absorption by the Prince of Excess, while Slaanesh's hunger had driven them to ever greater efforts to preserve their souls. With both deities silenced, the Eldar found themselves truly alone in the universe for the first time in their history. Yet from this realization came opportunity. The Harlequins, masters of the webway's hidden paths, began to coordinate the greatest gathering of Eldar power in recorded history. Troops that had not worked together since the days immediately following the fall began to converge on hidden nodes throughout the galaxy, their movements guided by strategies that transcended the normal boundaries of craft-world politics and dark Eldar ambition. On the twilight world of Liandon Prime, where the veil between life and death had always been thin, Ivrain the Visarch felt stirrings in the realm where Inead, the Eldar god of death, had been slowly awakening for millennia. The daughter of Shades, prophet of the nascent deity, whose birth had been prophesied to herald the Eldar's final victory over chaos, sensed opportunity in the crisis that gripped the galaxy. Inead stirs, she reported to her followers, her voice carrying the authority of one who walked between worlds. The silence that has claimed the other gods has not touched the realm of death, for death exists beyond the boundaries of psychic energy. Our god yet lives, yet grows, yet prepares for the moment when he can break through to claim his rightful place in reality. The Inari, those Eldar who had embraced the path of death and rebirth, began to channel their remaining psychic energies into rituals that had been deemed too dangerous to attempt under normal circumstances. They sought to use the power of death itself to punch through the silence, to create conduits through which Inead's influence could reach the material realm and restore the psychic balance that the Eldar needed to survive. In the depths of Komorra, where cruelty had been elevated to an art form and suffering distilled into its purest essence, Asdrubal Vecht made a decision that surprised even his most trusted advisors. The supreme overlord of the Dark City, architect of torments that spanned millennia, began releasing stores of psychic energy that had been accumulated through countless generations of torture and degradation. Better to spend our reserves in a gamble for survival, Vecht declared to his assembled Archons, than to hoard them while we all perish from psychic starvation. The pain we have harvested from 1 billion souls may yet serve to preserve our race, even if it means sharing our bounty with our cousins in their flying tombs. The decision sent shockwaves through Komorra's political structure, as cabals that had spent centuries accumulating psychic wealth found themselves contributing to a cause that offered no immediate benefit. Yet even the most ruthless Archons could not deny the logic of Vecht's position. The Dark Eldar's entire civilization depended on the psychic energy they harvested from their victims' suffering. Without it, they would age and die like mortals, their eternal youth and supernatural abilities fading into mundane humanity. As the combined psychic energies of the Eldar race began to flow through hidden channels toward convergence points throughout the galaxy, the cost of the endeavor became apparent. Eldar who had survived for millennia began to age and die as their essential life force was drawn into the Great Working. Craftworld populations, already diminished by endless war and slow decline, faced further reduction as their most psychically gifted members sacrificed themselves to power the ritual that might save their species. On Craftworld Alatok, where the Rangers had always walked the paths between worlds, entire families of seers collapsed as their life essence was drawn into the growing vortex of power. Their sacrifice was willing, their purpose clear. Yet the sight of ancient Eldar withering away like autumn leaves filled even the most stoic observers with profound grief. These were beings who had survived the fall itself, who had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, now reduced to dust in service to a cause whose success remained uncertain. The Great Working began to manifest as localized disturbances in the fabric of reality itself. Across the galaxy, small pockets of space began to exhibit renewed psychic activity, islands of warp energy in a sea of silence. These zones, no larger than individual star systems, flickered with the familiar chaotic energies that the Eldar knew so well. Within them, Psykers found their abilities partially restored, though at greatly reduced strength. Yet the success came at a price that staggered even those who had planned for significant losses. The psychic backlash from forcing energy through the silence consumed Eldar souls by the thousands, leaving behind empty bodies that crumbled to dust within moments. Entire craft world populations found themselves reduced by half as their life force was channeled into sustaining the pockets of restored psychic activity. Eldrad himself felt the drain as his ancient consciousness struggled to maintain the complex calculations needed to coordinate the galaxy-spanning ritual. His Wraithbone staff, which had channeled the power of countless spells across the millennia, began to crack and splinter as energies beyond its capacity flowed through its crystalline matrix. The greatest seer of his generation found himself aging for the first time in centuries, his immortal flesh finally succumbing to the weight of eons. Yet even as he felt his life ebbing away, Eldrad pressed forward with the working, knowing that failure would mean the extinction of everything his people had fought to preserve. The pockets of psychic activity began to stabilize, creating refuges where the Eldar could survive, and perhaps even begin to rebuild their shattered civilization. The cost had been enormous, but the alternative would have been absolute. As the ritual reached its climax, observers across the galaxy detected the emergence of what Imperial scholars would later term psychic oases, regions of space where the silence had been temporarily broken, where the warp's energies flowed once again in controlled streams. These zones were small and unstable, requiring constant maintenance to prevent their collapse back into the greater silence, yet they represented hope for races that depended on psychic energy for their survival. The Eldar had succeeded in creating a partial solution to the crisis, but the victory was Pyrrhic in the extreme. Their numbers, already reduced by millennia of decline, had been further diminished by the sacrifice required to restore even these limited pockets of psychic activity. The ancient race that had once ruled the galaxy found itself reduced to scattered survivors, huddling around the guttering flames of restored warp energy, their future more uncertain than ever. Yet in their desperate gambit, they had proven that the silence was not absolute, that the barriers separating the material realm from the sea of souls could be breached through sufficient sacrifice and determination. The question that remained was whether anyone would be willing to pay the price required to restore psychic balance to the galaxy as a whole, and whether enough would survive such an effort to make the victory meaningful. The silence continued across the vast majority of the galaxy, patient and inexorable, while in the small refuges created by Eldar sacrifice, psychic energy flowed once again. It was a beginning, perhaps, but one born from such loss that it felt more like an ending. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, where the foundations of Terra's greatest fortress rested upon bedrock that had known the footsteps of kings before humanity reached the stars, ancient mechanisms stirred to life after 10 millennia of patient waiting. Archmagos Belisarius Call descended through passages that existed on no official schematic, his augmented consciousness processing data streams that suggested the presence of technology far older than the Imperium itself. The discovery had begun with routine maintenance scans of the Golden Throne's supporting infrastructure, investigations prompted by the device's mysterious transformation during the warp's silence. Call's servo-skulls had detected energy signatures emanating from chambers that should not have existed, emanations that followed patterns his ancient databases recognized with growing alarm. The readings matched xenotech configurations that he had encountered only in the most classified archives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, technologies that bore the unmistakable signatures of Necron construction. Impossible, Carl whispered to his accompanying tech adepts, his mechadendrites extending to interface with detection systems that had never been designed by human hands. The chambers they discovered were vast beyond comprehension, carved from living rock and lined with materials that existed nowhere in Imperial science. At their heart sat a device whose function was unmistakable to one who had studied the Silent King's technology for centuries. The Null Echo Weapon, that ancient artifact of the war in heaven which Sharek had recognized from his memory engrams, rested within a crystalline matrix that pulsed with energies that seemed to exist outside normal space-time. The device was not Necron in origin, Carl realized as his sensors analyzed its construction, but rather a hybrid creation that merged xenotech principles with human innovation and something else entirely. Something that his cogitators identified as technologies that predated both species by unimaginable spans of time. Around the central weapon, support systems hummed with quiet efficiency, their functions gradually becoming clear to Call's enhanced understanding. Power conduits that tapped directly into Terra's core fed energy to projection arrays that could broadcast the device's null field across galactic distances. Control mechanisms showed evidence of recent activation, their interfaces displaying high Gothic characters alongside Xeno's sigils that dated back to humanity's earliest expansion into the stars. Most disturbing of all were the maintenance logs that Cole discovered within the device's data cores, records that detailed 10,000 years of careful preparation and modification. The entries were signed with the personal seal of the Emperor himself, documenting a project that had begun during the earliest days of the Great Crusade and continued through the dark years following the Horus Heresy. Each modification had been planned and implemented with the precision that marked the master of mankind's greatest works, yet the purpose behind them challenged everything Carl thought he knew about his lord's intentions. The truth, when it emerged from the device's memory banks, struck Carl with the force of divine revelation. The Emperor had not merely discovered the Null Echo weapon, he had orchestrated its placement beneath Terra as part of a bargain struck with Sharek the Silent King during the early years of the Great Crusade. The agreement, recorded in data formats that existed in both human and Necron archives, detailed an exchange of knowledge and technology that would have been considered heretical by any imperial citizen. The Emperor's foresight had encompassed possibilities that reached far beyond the immediate concerns of galactic conquest. He had perceived the eventual corruption of the warp, the growing influence of chaos that would culminate in events like the Great Rift's opening. The Null Echo device represented his ultimate contingency plan, a means of temporarily severing the galaxy's connection to the immaterial realm until such time as a more permanent solution could be implemented. Yet as Call delved deeper into the device's operational parameters, he discovered flaws in the plan that filled even his mechanical heart with dread. The weapon had been designed to operate for a limited duration, its null field gradually diminishing over a period of solar months until psychic energy could safely return to the galaxy. Instead, the device showed signs of cascading failure that threatened to make its effects permanent, trapping the galaxy in psychic silence until the slow death of consciousness itself rendered the question moot. In the Lord Regent's private chambers, aboard the flagship Macragger's Honor, Robert Gilliman made his own disturbing discovery among documents that had been sealed since the dark days immediately following the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne. The dataslates, marked with his father's personal cipher and dated to periods when the Primarch had been recovering from his resurrection, contained plans that revealed the true scope of the Emperor's preparations for this moment. The Master of Mankind had foreseen not merely the necessity of silencing the warp, but the specific circumstances under which such drastic action would become unavoidable. References to the Great Rift's opening, to the psychic awakening that had followed, and to the specific threats that would emerge in the galaxy's darkest hour, filled pages of strategic analysis that demonstrated prescience beyond mortal comprehension. Most shocking of all was the discovery of Guilliman's own role in his father's plans. The Primarch's resurrection, his return to active leadership of the Imperium, and even his specific assignments following his awakening had been orchestrated to position him perfectly for the crisis that was now unfolding. The Emperor had known that his son would need to make the final choice about the Null Echo device's fate, had planned for Guilliman to serve as the instrument through which the galaxy's future would be decided. The revelation that his entire post-resurrection existence had been guided by his father's manipulations struck Guilliman with profound dismay. Every decision he had made, every battle he had fought, every policy he had implemented, had served the Emperor's grand design in ways that the Primarch had never suspected. The autonomy he had believed himself to possess, the independence of thought that had allowed him to reshape the Imperium according to his own vision, had been illusions carefully maintained by a master manipulator whose plans spanned millennia. As word of these discoveries spread through the highest levels of Imperial command, reactions ranged from awed acceptance to furious betrayal. Captain General Valoris, whose custodian guard had unknowingly served as guardians of the Emperor's deepest secret, found himself torn between admiration for his master's foresight and horror at the deception that had been maintained for 10,000 years. The revelation that the Adeptus Custodes had been protecting not merely the Emperor's body, but the instruments of his ultimate plan, challenged assumptions that had guided their order since its founding. High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, whose chapter had fought countless battles against the forces of chaos, declared the Emperor's actions to be the ultimate expression of divine wisdom. Our Lord saw the corruption that would consume the galaxy, and chose to cut it out like a cancer, he proclaimed to his assembled commanders. That he possessed the foresight and courage to make such a decision only confirms his divinity and our duty to serve his will without question. Yet others reacted with dismay that bordered on heresy. Lord Commander Solar Machareus the Younger, descendant of the legendary general and veteran of campaigns against the archenemy, questioned whether any goal could justify the means the Emperor had chosen to achieve it. If our master was willing to deceive his own sons and sacrifice entire populations to psychic starvation, how can we be certain that his ultimate intentions align with humanity's survival rather than some purpose we cannot comprehend? The debate that erupted within Imperial command structures threatened to tear apart the unity that Guilliman had spent decades building. Some factions argued that the Emperor's plan should be allowed to run its course, that the temporary suffering caused by psychic silence was preferable to the eternal damnation that chaos offered. Others demanded immediate action to restore the warp's function, regardless of the risks such action might entail. In the midst of this chaos, reports arrived from across the galaxy, describing the accelerating breakdown of the Null Echo device's control systems. The weapon that had been designed to provide temporary relief from Chaos's influence was showing signs of permanent malfunction that would leave the galaxy trapped in silence forever. The psychic oases that the Eldar had created through their desperate sacrifice were beginning to fail as the device's null field intensified beyond its original parameters. Tech priests monitoring the weapon's status reported cascading system failures that suggested the device was consuming itself in its efforts to maintain the null field across galactic distances. Without immediate intervention, they estimated that the weapon would either achieve complete psychic sterilization of the galaxy or suffer catastrophic failure that might tear holes in reality itself. Either outcome would represent the end of conscious life as it had existed for millions of years. The race against time began as imperial forces mobilized to reach the deepest chambers beneath Terra, where the null echo device waited in its crystalline matrix. Yet access to the weapon was protected by security protocols that had been established by the Emperor himself, systems that required not merely authority, but specific genetic markers and psychic signatures that had been designed to exclude all but his chosen instruments. Guilliman found himself holding the key to these defenses in the form of access codes that his father had hidden within the data slates discovered in his private chambers. The Primarch possessed the means to reach the device and potentially modify its function, yet the choice of what action to take remained his own. The Emperor's plans had brought the galaxy to this moment, but they had also ensured that the final decision would rest with one who possessed both the authority to act and the wisdom to understand the consequences of any choice. As Imperial forces began their descent into Terra's deepest foundations, the weight of decision pressed upon Guilliman with crushing force. Before him lay the power to restore psychic energy to the galaxy, to end the silence that was slowly killing entire species. Yet that same power carried the risk of unleashing chaos influences that might prove even more destructive than the cure. The Emperor's ultimate plan had brought his son to the moment of choice, but it had not dictated what that choice should be. The silence continued, patient and expectant, while in the depths of Terra's ancient bedrock, the device that controlled the galaxy's fate waited for the hand that would determine whether consciousness would survive or perish in the name of order. The revelation of the Emperor's deception had divided those who served him, yet it had also provided them with the knowledge needed to act. Whether that knowledge would lead to salvation or damnation remained to be seen. In the deepest chambers beneath the Imperial Palace, where the bedrock of Terra held secrets older than human civilization, Robert Guilliman led the most unlikely expedition in the galaxy's recorded history. The Lord Regent of the Imperium walked beside Archmagos Belisarius Cawl, whose mechanical senses mapped passages that existed on no mortal schematic, while Captain General Trajan Valoris brought with him a guard of custodians whose loyalty had been tested by revelations that shook the foundations of their faith. Yet it was the presence of the fourth member of their party that would have shocked any observer into silence. The Necron envoy that accompanied them moved with the fluid grace of living metal, its form wrought from technologies that predated human evolution by millions of years. The Silent King's representative had arrived through means that defied imperial understanding, materializing from quantum tunnels that connected Terra to tomb worlds at the galaxy's edge. "The device responds to our proximity," Cawl reported as they descended through corridors carved from living rock, his augmented senses detecting energy fluctuations that suggested the awakening of powers beyond mortal comprehension. The passages they followed had been sealed for 10 millennia, yet showed no signs of age or decay, as if time itself had been held in abeyance within their crystalline walls. The chamber that awaited them at the journey's end defied description through any human language. At its heart stood the null echo device, a fusion of technologies that represented the combined genius of 3 civilizations separated by eons of development. Necron quantum matrices provided the theoretical framework. Golden Age human engineering supplied the practical implementation, and binding both together was something that could only be described as the Emperor's own essence, crystallized into forms that existed partially outside normal reality. The device pulsed with energies that made the air itself sing with harmonics that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to consciousness. Around its central core, supporting systems hummed with the quiet efficiency of mechanisms that had operated without maintenance for thousands of years. their functions guided by an intelligence that transcended the boundaries between organic and artificial thought. As Gilliman and his companions approached the device, space itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. The Necron envoy extended sensory appendages that interfaced directly with the ancient machinery, its movements suggesting communication on levels that human consciousness could not perceive. Through quantum entanglement networks that spanned the galaxy, the Silent King's presence manifested as a holographic projection that filled the chamber with the weight of eons. Primarch, Zarek's voice resonated through speakers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. You arrive at the moment of ultimate choice. The device that we built together, your father and I, was meant to provide a respite from the chaos that threatened to consume all rational thought. Yet time and the cosmos conspire against even the best-laid plans. What was meant to be temporary has become permanent, and what was meant to heal has become a different form of disease. The Silent King's hologram gestured toward displays that showed the device's failing containment systems, quantum matrices that had been strained beyond their design parameters by the effort of maintaining a galactic-scale null field. The choice before you is binary and absolute. We can allow the device to complete its transformation, severing the galaxy permanently from the realm of souls and preserving order at the cost of growth. Or we can restore the connection to the warp, accepting the return of chaos in exchange for the possibility of transcendence. Yet even as Zarek spoke, alarms began to echo through the chamber's crystal walls. Above them, in the upper levels of the Imperial Palace, Chaos forces launched their most desperate assault in 10,000 years. What remained of the traitor legions, unified by desperation rather than divine command, had gathered their remaining strength for one final attempt to reclaim the power they had lost. Abaddon the Despoiler, leading what remained of the Black Legion, brought with him warriors from every traitor faction that still possessed the means to reach Terra. Word-bearers whose faith had been shattered by divine silence marched alongside iron warriors who saw opportunity in the crisis. Demon engines that had become mere metal participated in the assault beside Chaos Marines, who had remembered what they once were before corruption claimed them. The battle that erupted across Terra's surface was unlike any conflict the Throne World had ever witnessed. Without the warp to fuel their supernatural abilities, the traitor forces fought with a desperation born of absolute necessity. They knew that failure would mean not merely defeat, but the permanent extinction of everything they had become in service to the dark gods. Yet their enemies fought with equal fervor, understanding that success would mean the return of threats that had plagued humanity for 10 millennia. In the depths beneath the palace, Guilliman felt the tremors of battle through the ancient stone, yet his attention remained focused on the choice that would determine not merely the outcome of this conflict, but the future of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. As he approached the device's control mechanisms, systems that had waited 10,000 years for this moment, he felt the presence of another consciousness reaching out to touch his own. The Emperor's communion came not through the warp, which remained silent, but through channels that existed beyond the traditional boundaries of psychic communication. The Master of Mankind's voice, when it reached his son's awareness, carried the weight of 10 millennia, spent in contemplation of this moment. "My son," the Emperor's presence whispered through quantum frequencies that bypassed normal sensation, "the time has come for you to understand the true purpose of this trial. The silence was never meant to be permanent, nor was it meant to be without cost. It was designed to teach the galaxy a lesson that could not be learned through words or commands, that the balance between order and chaos, between psychic power and material existence, is not a battle to be won, but a tension to be maintained." Guilliman's enhanced mind processed the implications of his father's words as his hands moved over control surfaces that responded to genetic markers encoded in his very cells. The device's displays showed options that had been prepared millennia in advance, configurations that would allow not merely restoration or continuation, but transformation into something entirely new. "The warp can be restored," the Emperor continued, his presence growing stronger as the moment of decision approached. "But it need not be restored unchanged. The technology before you, born from the marriage of Xenos science and human innovation, can create a new balance. Psychic energy can flow once more, but constrained by barriers that prevent the worst excesses of chaos while preserving the potential for growth and transcendence that makes consciousness valuable." The choice, when Gilliman finally made it, was guided not by ideology or desperation, but by the understanding that had grown within him during the long weeks of silence. The galaxy had learned to function without the constant presence of psychic chaos, had discovered forms of cooperation and innovation that would have been impossible under the old system. Yet it had also learned the cost of absolute order, the slow death of creativity and wonder that came with the severing of consciousness from its transcendent potential. His hands moved across the control mechanisms with precision born of genetic programming and paternal guidance, implementing modifications that transformed the null echo device from a weapon of suppression into an instrument of balance. The massive machinery responded to his commands with harmonics that sang of possibility rather than constraint, its quantum matrices reconfiguring themselves to create something that had never existed in the galaxy's history. The change, when it came, was felt across every world where conscious beings dwelt. The absolute silence that had gripped the galaxy for weeks gave way to something subtler, a gentle background hum of psychic energy that carried neither the chaos of unrestricted warp flow nor the sterility of complete suppression. Psykers across the galaxy felt their abilities return, yet diminished and constrained by invisible barriers that prevented the worst excesses while preserving the potential for growth. On demon worlds that had known only silence, new forms of existence began to emerge as entities that were neither fully chaotic nor entirely material found ways to manifest within the new paradigm. The chaos gods themselves remained present, but muted, their influence constrained by the barriers Guilliman had activated, yet not eliminated entirely. The eternal war between order and chaos continued, but at a level that allowed for the possibility of victory rather than mere survival. Across the galaxy, the factions that had learned to cooperate during the silence found that their new alliances remained viable even as their traditional powers returned. Eldar, who had worked with humans, Necrons, who had protected organic life, even Orcs, who had learned to think tactically, discovered that the changed nature of psychic energy made their cooperation not only possible, but advantageous. The battle for Terra ended not with the triumph of either side, but with the recognition that the conflict itself had been transformed. Chaos Marines who had regained fragments of their humanity found themselves questioning whether their ancient rebellions still held meaning. Imperial forces who had learned to value cooperation over dominance began to implement policies that would have been impossible under the old system. In the depths beneath the palace, as the transformed device settled into its new operational parameters, Guilliman felt his father's presence begin to fade. The Emperor's final words carried both blessing and burden. "The choice was yours to make, my son, yet the consequences will be borne by all who draw breath. You have given the galaxy a chance to grow beyond its ancient patterns, but growth requires guidance. That task, too, falls to you." The Lord Regent emerged from the depths to find a galaxy forever changed by the choices made in those crystalline chambers. The warp flowed once more, but constrained and balanced in ways that prevented the worst catastrophes while preserving the potential for transcendence. Psykers retained their abilities, but found them working in harmony with material existence rather than in opposition to it. The forces of chaos remained present but diminished, capable of influence but not domination. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis had forged new relationships between species and factions that had been enemies for millennia. The Necrons, having played their role in preserving consciousness itself, found themselves welcomed as unlikely allies rather than ancient threats. The Eldar, whose sacrifice had preserved psychic oases during the darkest hours, discovered new forms of cooperation with younger races. Even the Orcs, transformed by the experience of individual consciousness, began to explore possibilities beyond their traditional role as galactic destroyers. The silence was broken, yet its lessons remained. The galaxy had learned that consciousness without growth was death, but also that growth without constraint was chaos. In the balance between these extremes lay the possibility of something greater than either order or disorder alone could achieve, the chance for all sentient life to evolve beyond the ancient patterns that had trapped them in cycles of war and destruction. The Emperor's greatest gamble had succeeded not through the imposition of his will, but through the wisdom of a son who understood that the future belonged not to any single vision, but to the choices made by all who possessed the gift of consciousness. The galaxy awakened to a new dawn, neither fully tamed nor entirely wild, but balanced on the knife's edge between order and chaos, where all transcendent possibilities lay waiting to be born.